My name's Matt, and this happened back in the fall of 2012. I was 31 at the time, working a regular warehouse job in Huntsville, Alabama. I'd been divorced for about a year, and even though I didn't like to admit it out loud, I was in a weird place mentally. Not depressed or anything like that, just restless. Tired of doing the same stuff, being around the same places, and waking up to the same beige apartment walls every morning. So I started doing small weekend trips, usually hikes, and eventually got into camping. By October, I'd been on maybe 5 or 6 solo camping trips. Nothing extreme, just simple stuff. I wasn't some mountain man. I stayed in state parks, followed the trails, packed freeze-dried meals, brought a flare just in case, and kept my phone charged. No wild stories, no weird injuries. Just peace, quiet, and cold mornings. That changed with one trip. It was the last weekend of October, a Saturday. I planned it out on a whim Friday night after my shift ended. I just needed to get out. No one was free to come with me, so I went alone again. I picked a forest area about 2 hours northeast of Huntsville, near the Tennessee border, some parts of South Cumberland State Park. Not a popular part of it either. I'd looked at the maps and picked an area where a few old trails wrapped around hills and some backwoods creeks. There weren't any established campgrounds, but it wasn't restricted either, just marked as backcountry. That's what drew me to it. I drove up early Saturday, got there around 9:30 in the morning, and parked at a little gravel pull-off spot with no other cars in sight. It was cold, around mid-40s, and leaves were all over the place. Most of the trees were in that bare phase where everything looked dry and gray. I loaded up my pack, tightened the straps, and set off into the woods. For the first few hours, everything was smooth. The ground was a little muddy from rain earlier in the week, but the trail itself was easy to follow. I moved deeper into the hills, where the path narrowed and started to fade. By noon, I'd gone a solid 5 miles in. There weren't any trail markers after a certain point, just old logs and what looked like parts of an abandoned hunting path. I wasn't worried. I had my GPS watch, a map printed from Google Earth, and plenty of daylight left. Around 2:30 p.m., I found a clearing that felt right for camp. It was a flat patch of dirt between a cluster of trees with a rock wall behind it. Looked like a small cliffside had crumbled decades ago. The spot had natural wind cover, and I could see animal prints nearby, which usually meant I was near water. Sure enough, when I walked downhill a bit, I found a narrow creek maybe 200 feet away. Everything checked out. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and boiled some water for dinner. Just another solo camp, quiet and cold, nothing special. The sun started going down before 6, and by 6:30 it was pitch black. I had a small fire going, nothing huge, just enough to keep warm and let the crackling fill the silence. I sat there in my camp chair for maybe an hour, staring into the flames and listening to the sounds. Owls, small twigs snapping, leaves drifting down. Then I put the fire out, zipped up the tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag with my flashlight on my chest. I didn't fall asleep right away. I never did on those trips. I always took an hour or two to settle down. So I just laid there, listening, thinking about work, thinking about how the woods always smelled like wet leaves and earth. I dozed off somewhere around 10:30, but I woke up again around 1 a.m., and it wasn't the cold or a dream. It was because I heard something. It was faint at first, a rustling sound, not too far from my tent. It wasn't wind or leaves falling. It was rhythmic, like someone stepping carefully, not crunching twigs, just brushing against dry leaves and dirt. I stayed perfectly still. I didn't grab my flashlight. I just listened. The noise circled me once, maybe 30 feet out. Then it stopped. Silence again, but not the usual kind. The quiet now felt stretched, like it was waiting for something. I stayed like that for at least 10 minutes. Then I heard it again, footsteps, but slower, closer. This time I reached slowly for my flashlight and clicked it on. The inside of my tent lit up, but the nylon walls blocked most of the light from getting outside. I wanted to unzip it and shine the beam out there, but I didn't. I just sat there breathing slowly, telling myself it was a deer, or a raccoon, or a fox. Then I heard something I'll never forget. It wasn't words, not breathing, not even movement. It was metal, like a faint clinking sound, like the noise of chain dragging against chain, or someone carrying a set of tools loosely. I froze, not like scared frozen. I literally couldn't move. I held my breath, my heart pounding, and I listened again. It faded after about 30 seconds. Slowly, whatever it was backed off step by step. I didn't move until almost sunrise. The second the sun lit up the woods, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. I expected to find nothing. Maybe paw prints or just leaves shifted around. But there were boot prints, actual human prints, and not mine. These were older, bigger. Some of them looked like they were circling where I'd placed my tent. Others looked newer, like they'd come in the middle of the night. I followed the prints for a bit, walking slowly through the trees. After maybe 50 yards, I found something I still can't explain. There was a rope tied between two trees, chest high. On the rope, 3 small rusted items were hanging. A tin can, a broken flashlight, and a single old boot. The kind with leather laces and a worn-out heel. It didn't look like garbage. It looked placed, arranged. Below it, the ground had been cleared, like someone had swept it recently. Even the leaves had been moved aside. I backed away slowly and returned to camp. Packed up everything in under 10 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't even fold things properly. I just shoved it all into my pack and took off down the same trail I'd come in on. But the weirdest part? After walking for half an hour, I realized I hadn't passed a single landmark I recognized. No weird branch formations, no split in the trail, no downed tree I'd stepped over on the way in. It was like I was on a new path. But my GPS said I was heading west, the right direction. I kept going. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to eat, just walked, focused on the sun and my GPS. Around noon, I hit a dirt service road that wasn't on any map I had. It was wide enough for a truck, and there were fresh tire tracks in the mud. I followed it west for maybe 2 more miles before I finally saw pavement. An actual road with a yellow divider line and a rusty stop sign. I didn't know where I was, but I was out. I hiked alongside the road for an hour before I finally flagged down a passing truck. The guy was an older man in a work jacket, probably mid-60s. I told him I'd gotten lost camping, didn't go into the rest. He didn't ask. He just nodded and drove me back to my car, which ended up being 20 miles south of where I'd come out. He said those woods weren't safe to camp in and that people used to get into trouble out there even back in the 70s. Said a few kids went missing once and they stopped running youth programs near there. That was the only time he spoke about it. When I got back to my apartment, I put my gear in the corner and didn't touch it for 3 weeks. I kept thinking about that rope, that chain sound, the boot prints. Eventually, I tried looking up incidents in that forest. Found nothing. No missing people matching that area in recent years. No shelters or ranger stations nearby. Just general stories. People hearing noises, hikers feeling watched, a couple of campers saying they'd seen weird structures. But no official reports. No news stories. Nothing I could use to make sense of what happened. I haven't been camping alone since. Not once. I still hike in groups, daylight only. Never stray from the marked paths. Never wander near backcountry zones that aren't on official trail maps. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night, but someone had been watching me. Someone had been close enough to circle my tent and walk off without making a sound. And they left things behind, signs for someone to find, or maybe just to send a message. Either way, I got the message, loud and clear, and I never went back. It was the fall of 2013. I had just turned 35, working a steady job at a hardware store in Central Oregon, not too far from Bend. That year had been one of the busiest for me, full of long shifts, backaches, and more caffeine than anyone should admit. By late October, I needed to get away. I didn't want to fly anywhere, didn't want hotels or cities. I wanted silence, trees, maybe some light rain, and no cell service. I remembered this small hollow off a gravel logging road, maybe an hour's drive south of Oak Ridge. I'd been there years earlier with a friend during a hunting trip. No one went out that far. There were no campsites, no RV lots, no signs. Just a narrow, muddy road that twisted through thick forest and dropped into a bowl-like clearing. At the bottom, there was a level patch surrounded by old growth and ridgelines, and a thin stream that curved around the far side. We'd seen deer there before, and even some black bear sign once. I packed light. My old Blue Dome tent, a worn-out sleeping bag I'd had since college, my pack, a small cooler with sandwich fixings, a camp stove, water jugs, and my Browning X-Bolt I used for deer season. I wasn't hunting this trip, but I never went into the woods without it, especially alone. It started raining the minute I turned off the main road that Thursday evening. Just a light drizzle at first, gentle enough to be pleasant. But the sky was heavy, that low gray blanket you know won't lift for days. The drive-in was slow. The logging road had eroded since I'd last been there, full of potholes and gullies. Branches scraped the sides of my truck, and more than once I had to back up and try a different angle to avoid sliding into a rut. By the time I pulled into the clearing, it was dusk. Rain hissed across the windshield and fog hung just above the trees. I killed the engine and sat for a second. There was something about that place when it was quiet. The way the trees leaned in, how the ridge on the north side towered up in jagged rock, the way everything smelled like wet pine and old soil. It didn't feel haunted or anything like that, just untouched, like time didn't mean much there. I got out and stretched, the cold air biting my skin. My boots sank into the soaked moss and leaf litter. I grabbed my gear and set up the tent near a low ring of stones that looked like it had once been a fire pit. The ground was soft but not flooded, and I hammered in the stakes hard. The rain picked up just as I was unrolling my sleeping bag, so I zipped the tent tight and sat inside, listening. Came down steady now, tapping like fingers against the nylon. I lit the camp stove under the flap and heated a can of soup. No music, no distractions, just the sound of the rain and my own breathing. Night came fast in the woods, black, full, quiet but not silent. Rain does weird things to the forest. It masks the small noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, makes everything feel closer. I must have fallen asleep early because I woke up stiff and cold in the middle of the night. My back ached from the uneven ground, and my legs were tangled in the sleeping bag. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The rain was still coming down hard, drumming the top of the tent in waves. I couldn't hear anything else. No wind, no animals, nothing. I opened the flap just a bit and shone the light outside. Mist clung to the ground like a blanket. The trees looked different in the rain, taller, more solid. I zipped it shut and lay back down, but something was wrong. It wasn't a noise exactly, more like an absence. No frogs, no owls, not even the usual rustling of squirrels or raccoons. Just the rain. I told myself it was just the weather, just the isolation, but I kept the rifle close by that night. The next morning, everything was soaked. My boots were damp inside, and water had pooled at one corner of the tent. I ate a cold sandwich and took a walk uphill behind the camp. The trail was barely visible, more a faint depression in the leaves. About 30 minutes in, I stopped. There were boot prints in the mud. Not mine. They were old, maybe a few days at least. The edges had softened from rain, but I could tell they were different. Larger than my own boots, the tread a different pattern. I crouched and followed them a few feet before they veered off the trail toward the north ridge. I stood there a while, unsure what to make of it. People hike out there sometimes, sure, hunters mostly, but I hadn't heard a single shot since I arrived, and no tire tracks had been on the road except mine. I decided to let it go. Back at camp, I set up a small tarp to cook under. I spent most of the day trying to stay dry and warm, built a small fire despite the wet wood. I didn't leave the camp again. That night, the rain got worse, came down in sheets, wind blowing it sideways. The tent held, but it felt like being inside a drum. I barely slept. At some point after midnight, I heard something outside. Not close, but not far. A sharp, wet sound, like something heavy stepping in mud. Then another, then nothing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited, rifle in hand, eyes wide open in the dark. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The next day, I found a deep impression near the tree line. Mud disturbed, pine needles swept aside. Not an animal. It looked like a heel print, just one. The rest of the ground around it was too covered in runoff to hold shape. It was enough for me to consider packing up. But I didn't. I'd driven out there to get away, and I wasn't about to let some vague footprint ruin the trip. The third night, the rain eased a little. I sat by the fire longer, even felt calm for a bit. But after I turned in, something changed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to piss. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, the cold biting through my jacket. The forest was soaked, dripping like a sponge wrung too tight. I walked a few feet from the tent, did my business, and turned to go back. That's when I saw it. A shape maybe 20 feet off, standing just at the edge of the trees, not moving. I froze. The beam of my light caught the shape briefly, enough to know it was human. A man, I think, drenched, standing still, face hidden under a hood or maybe just lost in shadow. I blinked and the beam slipped off him, light catching on wet bark and fog. When I swung it back, he was gone. I didn't hear him leave. No footsteps, just gone. I ran back to the tent and zipped it shut. Sat there the rest of the night, gripping the rifle, light off, heart hammering so loud I thought it had burst. In the morning, I found prints again. Fresh ones this time. They circled the tent once, then led off toward the stream. I followed them with shaking hands. They went right up to the bank and stopped. No tracks on the other side. Nothing. Just that quiet water sliding through moss and stone. That was it for me. I packed everything, threw the wet gear in the back of the truck, and got out of there. Took the long way down the mountain, checking my rearview mirror the whole time. I never figured out who that was or what they wanted. Maybe another camper, lost or drunk. Maybe someone who lived out there off the grid. Or maybe just someone who didn't want me there. What sticks with me is how quiet he was. How still. No shouting, no threats. Just that look, that presence. Felt like he wasn't surprised to see me. Like he'd been waiting. I haven't been back to that hollow since. And I don't camp alone anymore. I was 38 the summer I decided to take some time off work and head out alone for a bit. I'd been working construction nonstop for months. No real weekends, and definitely no vacation. I needed quiet, space, and trees. So when the last project wrapped up at the end of June, I packed up my gear, filled the truck with gas, and drove north out of Redding into Oregon. The plan was simple. Find a spot near Umpqua National Forest that wasn't crowded, camp for 3 or 4 nights, and just relax. I wasn't looking for hiking trails or tourist stuff. I wanted to be off the grid. It was early July 2021. The weather was good. Warm in the day, cool at night. Just enough breeze to keep the bugs down. I'd loaded up with all the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, water jugs, cooking gear, my old 12 gauge, just for bears or cougars, never had to use it, a few paperbacks, and enough food to last a week. I didn't plan to fish or hunt. This trip was about doing nothing. I drove up into the forest on a Tuesday morning, taking back roads off Route 138. No reservations, just scouting spots. I followed a narrow gravel road for almost an hour until I found a turnout that looked good. The road was rough, steep in places, trees scraping the truck, but I liked that. The harder it was to get in, the less chance anyone else would be around. This turnout had enough room for the truck and some space behind it to set up camp, surrounded on all sides by tall Douglas firs and underbrush. A narrow trail led deeper into the woods from one side. I didn't know where it went and didn't care. I set up camp, pitched the tent, rolled out the sleeping pad and bag, set up a small fire pit with rocks, and pulled out the fold-up chair. No cell service, which was exactly what I wanted. The silence was good. All I could hear were birds, wind, and the occasional rustle of branches. No engines, no people, just the woods. That first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple dinner, beans and rice on the camp stove, and watched the fire until it burned down. I had a small solar light hanging inside the tent but barely used it. I was asleep before 10. A few animal sounds in the distance, maybe raccoons or deer, but nothing unusual. I've camped enough to know the normal sounds out there. The second day was more of the same. I walked a little down the trail behind the camp, just to stretch my legs. It didn't go far, maybe 100 yards before it turned and disappeared into thicker brush. I didn't follow it. There was no point. I just sat around reading, napping, and tending the fire when the sun dropped. That night, though, I noticed something that gave me pause. I was lying in the tent, just starting to drift off when I heard a crack. A sharp one. Not far. Not like a branch falling on its own, but something stepping on a stick. It was close enough that I froze. Then another. 2 quick steps. I sat up, heart kicking a little faster. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. No more steps, no rustling. I figured maybe a deer wandered close. Still, I got out quietly, grabbed the flashlight and my shotgun, and stepped out. The fire had burned down to embers, but the moonlight was strong. I walked the perimeter of the camp, scanning the tree line. No eye shine, no movement. Everything looked normal. After about 10 minutes, I went back in, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I checked around the site, just in case. Nothing stood out. No tracks, no disturbed brush. I convinced myself it was nothing. The forest plays tricks on your ears sometimes, especially when you're alone. That day, I stayed near camp. I felt a little on edge and didn't want to wander far. Around late afternoon, I thought I heard something again. This time, a faint snap in the distance, like a footstep on dry wood. I stood still and listened for a good minute. Nothing followed it. Could have been a squirrel. Could have been anything. But my gut started whispering something I didn't want to hear. Someone's out here. That night, I barely slept. I kept the shotgun closer. Every rustle, every crack, made my nerves jump. Around 2 a.m., I sat up again. I swear I heard movement, not an animal. Slow, heavy steps, human steps. I eased out of the tent and crouched beside it, listening hard. I didn't shine the light. I didn't want to give away my position. The sound was off to the right, maybe 20 feet into the trees. It wasn't steady. One step, pause, another, then silence. I stayed like that for 15, maybe 20 minutes. Nothing more. Then I heard what sounded like retreating steps, still slow, like someone backing away. After another long wait, I got back in the tent and waited for morning. By dawn, I was packing. I didn't care if it cut the trip short. Something wasn't right. I loaded up quick, keeping my ears open. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel it. I wasn't alone. I backed the truck out, turned around slowly, and headed down the gravel road the way I came in. Here's where it got worse. About 20 minutes down, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the edge of the road, where the brush cleared a little, there was a footprint in the dirt. A boot print, not mine. I stopped and got out to look. It was fresher than it should have been. Edges still sharp. No rain overnight. I hadn't seen anyone up here the whole time, but someone else had been walking these woods. Following, I got back in the truck fast and kept driving. The rest of the trip out was nerve-wracking. Every curve of the road made me think I'd see someone blocking the way, but no one was there. I made it out to the main road by late morning. I didn't stop until I was 40 miles south, back near Roseburg. I checked into a cheap motel, locked the door, and slept most of the day. My body was done, but my mind kept spinning. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. Not because I thought they'd laugh, I just didn't know how to explain it. There's nothing dramatic about it. No big twist, no confrontation, just a presence. Something wrong, someone out there. 2 months later, I read an article online. A hiker had gone missing in the Umpqua area. Solo trip. Van found at a trailhead. No trace. The article didn't mention where exactly, but my hands started sweating reading it. I still camp, still hike, but never alone anymore, and I never go back to Oregon. I had been working as a park ranger in Wyoming for just over 11 years by the time this happened. It was 2017 and I was 39 years old, in good shape, and used to long stints out in the woods, whether alone or with a partner. The national park I was assigned to covered hundreds of square miles of dense forest, mountainous terrain, canyons, and backcountry that saw only a fraction of the visitors compared to the more developed areas. That isolation made it beautiful but also unpredictable. The incident happened in late September. It had been a long, dry summer, but the nights were starting to cool down fast. Elk were beginning to move down from the higher elevations, and with them came hunters, both legal and illegal. One of our main jobs during that time was to patrol the less traveled areas where poachers liked to set up. Some of them were regulars, and we knew where they liked to operate. Others were new or more careful, and that's where it got tricky. That week, I had been assigned to a remote section of the park near Ridge Trail, a barely maintained path about 17 miles from the nearest ranger station. The trail ran along the base of a narrow ridgeline and was surrounded by thick pine forest on both sides. It wasn't part of any main camping loop, and there were no real campsites out there, just open woods, heavy undergrowth, and a few game trails. I left the station on a Wednesday morning with my pack, enough supplies for 4 days, a rifle, a satellite phone, and a notebook where I logged sightings and suspicious activity. I hiked in about 8 miles the first day and set up camp in a small clearing I had used before, not far from a dry creek bed. I knew the spot. It was quiet and well hidden, with enough space to set up my tent and start a small fire for warmth once the sun went down. The first night passed like most do out there. Crickets, the occasional coyote yipping in the distance, and the rustling of small animals moving through the brush. I was used to it. I'd grown used to everything about being out in the woods, even when it got uncomfortable. What I wasn't used to was what happened on the second day. That morning, I followed a game trail north of the camp, about 3 miles up near the edge of the ridge, where I had seen some suspicious boot prints the year before. The trail was barely there, just a faint path beaten down by elk hooves and maybe the occasional hiker who strayed too far. I had to move carefully, using my compass and markers to avoid getting turned around. By noon, I came across an old fire ring, just blackened stones and some broken branches, but it looked used, recent, maybe a day or two old. That wasn't good. Fires weren't allowed in that part of the park without a permit, and no one was supposed to be camping there anyway. I checked the area more closely. There were signs. An empty food wrapper tucked under a rock, some flattened grass where a tent might have been, and a couple of cigarette butts. Not just visitors. Someone had been staying there. Poacher, I figured. Could be someone waiting on the elk or scouting out a hunting spot. I noted the GPS coordinates and hiked back down to camp, planning to report it when I checked in that evening over the satellite phone. That's when I first noticed something off. When I got back to my camp, I saw that one of the guy lines on my tent had been pulled out of the ground. First, I thought it was the wind, but then I looked closer. The stake had been set aside neatly on a rock next to the tent. Not yanked out, picked up and placed. That made my stomach drop a little. There were no footprints. Whoever it was knew how to cover their tracks. I did a quick inventory. Nothing was taken, not my rifle, not my food, not my gear. But my water bottle had been moved a few feet from where I left it, and a small pine cone had been placed on top of my notebook. Like someone had been there, and they wanted me to know. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the fire going low and my rifle close. I didn't hear anything unusual, just whine through the trees and some movement in the underbrush that could have been anything. Still, I felt like I was being watched. I had felt that before on occasion, but this was different. It wasn't just unease. It was deliberate, like something was choosing to stay just far enough out of sight. The third day, I debated hiking back out, but I didn't want to leave without trying to figure out what was going on. I decided to hike back up toward the fire ring. Maybe I had missed something. I left my gear packed in case I needed to leave quickly. When I got to the fire ring again, I followed a faint trail that led further uphill, toward a rocky outcrop that gave a view of the valley below. That's when I found it. A small camp, well hidden under the trees, camouflaged with brush and branches. There was a tarp set up between two trees, a small folding chair, some empty cans of food, and a half-burned log in a ring of stones. But no tent, no bedroll, and no one in sight. I didn't want to touch anything, but I looked around as carefully as I could. What really bothered me was a small notebook I saw sitting open on a stump. It was dirty and weather-stained, and I shouldn't have touched it, but I flipped through it briefly. Most of it was just dates and short phrases like ridge or elk tracks or wait until dark. But one entry stood out. Watched ranger pass below again. Camped at the same spot. Left message. That was 2 days ago. The same day I found my tent stake moved. My heart was pounding. I backed out of there and hiked straight down to my camp, packed everything, and started heading out of the woods. I had my rifle in hand the whole time, but I didn't make it out that night. It got too dark too fast, and the terrain was steep and uneven. I didn't want to risk twisting an ankle in the dark. I set up a cold camp in a shallow draw near the trail. No fire, just my sleeping bag tucked behind a large boulder. I stayed awake most of the night, listening. The wind picked up around midnight. Then I heard it, a stick snapping. Then another, not close but not far either. I laid flat, barely breathing. And then, just before dawn, I heard the distinct sound of someone coughing. Dry, short. A man. It was followed by silence. I didn't move until it got light. When I finally hiked out and got back to the station, I filed a full report, handed in the coordinates, and told my supervisor everything. Law enforcement rangers went in 2 days later. They found the camp, but it was stripped clean by then. No food, no tarp, no notebook. Just the fire ring and the marks where a chair had been. Whoever it was, they were watching me for at least 2 days. They knew the area. They knew how to move without being seen. They didn't take anything. They didn't confront me. They just let me know they were there. After that trip, I didn't go back to Ridge Trail. We did a few flyovers in the following weeks, but never saw another camp. A few months later, winter set in and everything got buried in snow. I still think about that camp. About the message. Someone was living out there, watching the park, watching me. Not a lost hiker. Not a casual poacher. Someone who didn't want to be found. and who knew exactly how to stay hidden. I transferred to a different region the next spring, somewhere flatter, closer to roads. I still do ranger work, but I haven't camped alone since. Not out there, not that deep, not anymore. It wasn't ghosts or monsters, just a person. A real person with real eyes and a real notebook. And that's what makes it worse. Because the forest is huge, and there are a lot of places someone can live without ever being seen. You might pass within 10 feet of them and never know it. I do my job. I still love the outdoors, but I don't trust it the same way anymore. Not after Ridge Trail. I was 34 the summer I decided to head up to the northwestern part of Montana, somewhere near the Canadian border, for a week of camping alone. It was the middle of July 2017, and I'd been stuck behind a desk for too long. Work had worn me down. The city noise, deadlines, and constant phone notifications had all started to feel like they were melting my brain. I needed quiet. I needed trees, cold mornings, and nights with only the sound of wind and bugs around me. I picked an area I'd never been to before, remote, well off the beaten path. The kind of place where you had to drive 2 hours on dirt roads just to find a good trailhead. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just my sister. She lived in California, and I sent her a text with a rough location, just in case something happened. I said I'd be back in a week. That was it. I had an old but reliable 2004 Subaru Forester. It was packed tight with gear, tent, food, a Jetboil stove, extra water, bear spray, a decent knife, a tarp, sleeping bag, and a GPS unit that still worked half the time. I also brought a Glock 19, which I had a permit for, though I never used it unless I went to the range once or twice a year. The first 2 days were perfect. I camped in a high clearing that overlooked miles of pine forest. No cell service, not even a whisper of reception. I had a book, I fished a little in a nearby stream, and I hiked around without seeing a single person. The stars at night looked unreal, like someone had spilled salt across black glass. By day 3, I moved to another spot deeper in the woods. I wanted to find something that felt more isolated. I followed a trail that wasn't marked and had clearly not been maintained in years. Fallen trees crossed it like broken bones. The kind of trail where you have to stop every 5 minutes to check your compass and make sure you didn't veer too far off course. After about 4 hours of hiking, I found a small clearing in a pocket of woods. The trees stood tall and packed in like they were shoulder to shoulder. There was an old fire ring made of blackened stones, probably from someone years before. I set up camp there. Everything felt normal until the next evening. That day had been hot. I'd gone out hiking again, looking for signs of animals, maybe hoping to see a moose or something. I got back around dusk, legs tired, back sweaty under my pack. I cooked a little rice and tuna, sat by the fire until the mosquitoes got bad, then crawled into my tent. It was sometime after midnight when I first heard the snapping. Not a branch falling, not a squirrel rustling leaves. It was the sharp, dry crack of something stepping on a stick. Heavy, deliberate. I held still. My tent was zipped tight, and the fire had long gone out. The darkness out there was thick. I laid there for a minute, barely breathing, trying to tell myself it was a deer, maybe an elk. But elk don't usually walk around alone. They move in herds, and the steps were slow, not the fast, awkward rustling of a four-legged animal. These were one at a time. Step, crack, pause, then another. Step, crack. I sat up inside the tent. My headlamp was clipped to the mesh pocket, but I didn't turn it on. My bear spray was next to me. I picked it up slowly, thumb over the trigger. I sat in total silence, heart hammering, ears straining. Nothing for a while, just the bugs. Then another snap, closer, It was maybe 20 feet from my tent. Too close. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe through my nose. Just shallow breaths through my mouth, trying not to make a sound. And then it stopped. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe an hour. Eventually, I laid back down, still holding the bear spray, eyes wide open, listening. Nothing else came that night, just silence. By morning, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a bear, maybe even a person who stumbled through without knowing I was there. But it didn't sit right. Something about how slow it was, how intentional, how it stopped close to me and never made a sound walking away. I made coffee, packed up my things, and moved camp again. I didn't go far, just a few miles uphill, near a rocky slope with a small creek. I made sure to step off the old trail and climb through thick underbrush to find a place that wasn't visible unless you stood right on top of it. No more clearings. I set up behind a large rock outcrop where I could hear if anyone approached through the brush. I stayed quiet all day, barely moved, just listened. That night was dead quiet, not even wind. I slept with my gun within reach. Still nothing came. No snaps, no movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The next day, I did a wide circle hike, trying to see if there were any signs of other people. Old boot prints, trash, anything. I found nothing. No trails. No fire pits, no wrappers or cans, just forest. Still, that feeling never left, like I was being watched. You can't explain it unless you've felt it. It's like a pressure on your neck, an awareness you don't want, but can't ignore. That night, I decided not to cook. I ate a cold granola bar and some jerky and left no smell, no light, no fire. I even zipped myself into the tent before the sun was fully down. And again, after midnight, I heard it. This time, it wasn't steps. It was breathing, came from outside the tent. Low, steady breaths, like someone standing just a few feet away. I couldn't see anything. The tent was dark. I didn't dare move, didn't reach for the light. I just held the gun, finger off the trigger but ready. The breathing went on for what felt like 5 minutes. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, there were no tracks. The ground was covered in pine needles, so nothing left a clear print. But some branches nearby looked bent, like someone had pushed through them recently. That day, I made the decision to leave. I had 3 days left in the week, but I couldn't take another night of that. I packed everything up by noon and started the long hike back. It was slow going. I had to stop and backtrack a few times. The woods felt tighter now, like they were trying to keep me in. Every sound felt like a footstep. Every bird call made me flinch. Took me most of the day to get near the trailhead. I had a few more miles to go when I saw it. A man. He was standing off to the side of the trail, maybe 30 yards away. Not moving, just standing there, facing me. He wore dark clothes, looked like an old green jacket and black pants. His face was mostly in shadow, but I could tell he had a beard. I stopped walking. He didn't wave, didn't speak, didn't move. I turned and left the trail, heart pounding. I moved fast but quiet, cutting through the trees, climbing a ridge I remembered from the hike in. I didn't stop for 30 minutes. When I looked back, I saw no one. Eventually, I got back to the car. The sun was low, and the air felt heavy, like it was about to rain. I didn't look around, just tossed my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. I drove the rough dirt road until I found pavement again, and I didn't stop driving until I was 3 towns south and checked into a small motel. That night, I showered 3 times. I locked the door, closed the curtains. I stared at the door for hours, listening to every sound in the hallway. In the morning, I felt more like myself again. I ate pancakes at a diner and tried to convince myself it was just a drifter, someone living off-grid, maybe a hunter, maybe just bad luck. But I couldn't get past the breathing, the slow, steady sound of it, just outside my tent. I never went back to that area. I still camp sometimes, but always in places with other people nearby. Never that far off the map again. And I still wonder what would have happened if I had unzipped the tent that night. I think about it more than I'd like, because something tells me he was waiting for that. I was 39 when it happened. It was the fall of 2016, late September. I had just gotten 2 weeks off work and figured I'd use it to get away from everything. I was doing okay mentally and physically, but I had this weight on my chest I couldn't explain. I wasn't seeing anyone, and things had been quiet for a while. Too quiet. I thought a camping trip would help clear my head. I live in southern Manitoba, and there's this area northwest of Whites Hill Provincial Park that I'd always wanted to check out. Thick woods, remote trails, old service roads, and quiet lakes. I packed up my gear, threw my dog, Rex, in the truck, and headed out early on a Tuesday morning. Rex was a big mutt, part German Shepherd, part something else. Loyal, sharp, and calm. I trusted him more than most people. The drive out was smooth, maybe 5 hours all in. I turned off the highway onto a gravel road that snaked through forest and swamps. My plan was to reach Pike Lake, a small, lesser-known lake a few kilometers from any kind of maintained campground. I'd read about it online. Someone had mentioned it on a hiking forum, said it was peaceful, untouched, and had a decent clearing along the north shore for setting up camp. By mid-afternoon, I pulled off onto a narrow dirt road barely wide enough for my truck. Branches scraped the sides as I inched forward. The trail was uneven and probably hadn't seen much traffic in years. Eventually, I reached a spot where the trail ended at a clearing near the edge of the lake. The water was calm and dark, reflecting the gray sky above. The air smelled clean, moss, pine, and damp earth. I set up the tent near the tree line, facing the lake. Rex sniffed around, tail wagging slowly, ears up. I made a small fire ring out of rocks and collected enough wood for the night. The wind picked up a little, rustling the leaves overhead. I remember feeling this strange kind of peace, like I had finally exhaled after weeks of tension. That first night was quiet. I cooked some beans and sausages over the fire and shared a bit with Rex. We sat there for a while, watching the fire dance and the stars blink on above us. Rex curled up next to me inside the tent, and I drifted off not long after sunset. I didn't hear a single sound that night, not one. The next morning, everything still felt normal. I boiled water for coffee, then we walked around the edge of the lake for a bit. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, deer, mostly, maybe a coyote. Nothing unusual. Around mid-morning, clouds rolled in thick and fast. I checked the barometer I always carry when camping and saw the pressure had dropped hard. It was going to rain. I spent the next few hours reinforcing the tent with extra lines, putting a tarp overhead, and stacking firewood under a lean-to I made with logs and a spare tarp. By early evening, the rain hit. Not hard at first, just a steady drizzle, but I could tell it was going to get worse. The temperature dropped too, and I threw on my heavier coat. Rex stayed close, watching the woods. He wasn't panicked, just alert. We ate quickly that night. The fire sputtered under the tarp, giving off just enough heat to take the edge off. I noticed something odd then. Rex kept looking in the same direction across the lake, toward a dark section of trees. He didn't growl, didn't bark, just stared. I couldn't see anything, but I've learned to pay attention when Rex does that. He didn't break his gaze for nearly 5 minutes. I chalked it up to an animal, maybe a deer or bear. I didn't hear anything moving through the brush though, and that was strange. Usually, in that kind of silence, you'd hear something even just walking. Rain hitting the leaves makes everything louder, not quieter. We went to bed early. The rain was constant now, heavier, beating down on the tent. Wind picked up sometime after midnight. I woke up a few times to Rex shifting around, ears twitching, head lifting like he'd heard something. I reached over and touched his side, and he relaxed. But around 3 a.m., he sat up stiff, facing the tent flap. His back legs were under him like he was ready to spring forward. I sat up too, listening hard. There was something, very faint, like a low crunch, then silence, then again, a single footstep, slow and heavy, somewhere beyond the edge of the trees. Then nothing, just the rain. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. My hand was on the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. Rex didn't bark. He just stayed there, ears fully upright. Eventually, after maybe 15 minutes, he laid back down. I didn't fall back asleep for hours. The next morning, it was gray and still raining. I stepped out, soaked despite my rain gear. I checked around the site, no tracks. The ground was a mess of mud and water, so anything could have been washed away. Still, something about the trees felt off, like the quiet had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, not even the buzzing of flies. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something held me there. Stubbornness, maybe. I'd planned this trip for months, and I didn't want to abandon it just because I got spooked by some animal in the night. That day, we stayed close to camp. I didn't go on my usual hike. Rex wouldn't leave my side. That evening, the rain eased just a bit, enough to get a proper fire going again. I tried to relax, cooked some food, drank some instant coffee. Around 7 p.m., I started hearing something across the lake, not far, maybe 100 meters through the trees. It wasn't an animal sound. It was rhythmic, not footsteps exactly, more like dragging, then stopping, then again, always stopping for a long moment, then picking up again. I stood there by the fire, every nerve on edge. Rex was right beside me, hackles up now. His head was low, and his teeth were slightly bared. He growled once, very low. The sound stopped, just cut off mid-movement. We stood there for maybe 10 minutes after that. I didn't sit back down. I didn't even eat the rest of the food. I put out the fire and got into the tent early. I didn't sleep. I just laid there, knife in hand, flashlight ready, listening. The rain kept on, steady but not loud. At one point, I heard a branch snap. Not a twig, a full branch. And it wasn't close. Somewhere back where the dragging sound had been. That night, I had dreams I can't even describe properly. Not nightmares, just things that didn't make sense. Shapes moving wrong. A sense of being watched. But not from one direction, from everywhere. I woke up drenched in sweat, even though it was cold. Rex was already up, pacing inside the tent. It was around 5 a.m. I got dressed, packed fast, didn't even bother cooking anything. Just shoved everything into the truck bed, soaked or not, and got out of there. About 15 minutes into the drive back, I passed something on the side of the narrow dirt trail. Something I didn't remember seeing on the way in. A piece of blue tarp, torn, half buried in the mud. It looked like it had been out there a while, but what caught my eye wasn't the tarp. It was the shape next to it. A rusted camp stove, half crushed, with a blackened pan still sitting on top. No tent, no gear, just those two things. Like someone had packed up in a rush and left them behind years ago. But there hadn't been any real rust on it when I looked closer. Just mud. The kind you get from being outside a few days. Not decades. I kept driving. Didn't stop again until I reached pavement. Back at home, I gave Rex a long bath, made a hot meal, and tried to forget about the whole thing. But I couldn't. Something was wrong out there. I'm not saying it was someone stalking us. I'm not saying it was some strange hermit or a hunter. I don't know. But I've camped all over Canada, and I've never felt that kind of pressure before. Like something was waiting for me to drop my guard. I still camp. I still take Rex with me, but I've never gone back to that part of the forest. I never even tried to find Pike Lake on a map again. Some places, I think, aren't meant to be revisited. Not because of superstition, but because not everything you find in the woods is supposed to be found. And sometimes, when something watches you long enough, it starts to think you belong to it. And that's a risk I won't take again. I was 34 when it happened. This was back in the summer of 2018. I had taken a week off from work, something I didn't do often, and decided I'd spend a few days alone in the woods. Not just any patch of forest either. I drove out to a quiet place in eastern Washington near the Idaho border, about an hour northeast of Spokane, where the trees were thick and the air was clean. There was a lake out there, a place my uncle used to take me and my cousins when we were younger. He'd stopped going after an accident involving a hunting buddy of his, and I never really understood why until later. But I remembered the trails, the cold water, the quiet. Felt like a good place to clear my head for a few days. I had a decent truck back then, a 2009 Tacoma I'd kept in good shape. I loaded it up with a cooler, camping gear, extra clothes, a couple of knives, and my .45 just in case. I didn't expect trouble. I never did. But I wasn't stupid either. People went missing in those woods sometimes. Animals, unstable ground, or just getting lost. I wasn't planning on wandering too far off any trails, though. I had a spot in mind, a flat little clearing by the south end of the lake that was rarely used. No picnic tables or fire rings, just dirt, moss, and some half-fallen trees. Perfect. Took me the better part of the day to get there. The last few miles of the drive were on washed-out Forest Service roads, winding around the slope of a mountain. I didn't see another person the whole time, just tracks from elk or moose and some flattened brush from old logging trucks. By the time I set up camp, pitched the tent, hung the tarp, and got the fire going, it was almost 6 p.m. The sun was still up, but it was starting to dip below the tree line. That part of the forest gets dark early. Tall pines and cedars crowd together so tight they barely let light through, even in the middle of the day. I cooked a little food, drank a beer, and listened to the water. I didn't even bring music. I just wanted quiet. The first night was peaceful. I woke up a couple of times to the sounds of sticks snapping outside the tent, but that's not unusual. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I had my food stored properly, hung between two trees, well away from camp. I wasn't worried. The air was cold by dawn, and a thin fog had rolled across the lake, so I put on a hoodie and made some instant coffee. By noon that day, I decided to hike around the lake. Not all the way, maybe 2 miles in each direction, then loop back. I brought water, a knife, a flare, and my sidearm. The trail was muddy, and the underbrush was dense in places. Every now and then I'd catch glimpses of the lake through the trees. Flat, glassy, still. No birds were out.
No frags.
I didn't even hear mosquitoes. Just the crunch of my boots and the occasional creak of old branches swaying in the breeze. Around the north side of the lake, I came across something strange. At first, I thought it was just a boulder or maybe an old tree stump that had been split open by lightning. But as I got closer, I saw it was something else. A crude shelter of some kind, branches and pieces of bark tied together with what looked like dried vine or maybe even sinew. It wasn't big enough to stand in, maybe 4 feet high, like something made for a child or an animal. But it wasn't made by animals. The structure was too deliberate. Someone had shaped the branches and lashed them together at angles that made a kind of warped triangle. The bark inside had been stripped smooth. I didn't touch it. I just stood there looking at it, trying to figure out why it made me so uneasy. There were no signs of recent use, no footprints, no fresh debris, no food wrappers or tools. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I walked back to camp a little faster than before. That night, the forest felt heavier. The air was colder, and the fire didn't seem to throw heat the same way it had the night before. I stayed up late, staring into the flames, feeling like something was watching from just beyond the light. But nothing moved. Nothing came close. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I left the tent zipper halfway open so I could hear the forest better. That was a mistake. Somewhere in the early morning, I heard it. The sound of twigs snapping close, then heavy footsteps, not charging or running, just slow, deliberate crunching. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. I just listened. It circled the tent. Whatever it was, big, heavier than a man but walking on 2 feet. No snorting or breathing like a bear, just steps. And then it stopped. I held my breath for what felt like 5 full minutes. Then I turned on the flashlight and stepped outside with the pistol drawn. The fire had died out completely. The woods were silent. There were no tracks. That made no sense. The dirt was soft. I could see my own boot prints, but nothing else. Not around the tent, not near the trees. Nothing. That shook me more than anything. I should have seen something, even one print, but the ground was clean. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat up with my back to a tree until the sky started to turn gray. The next day, I thought about packing up, but I didn't want to admit that something had rattled me. I've been out in the woods dozens of times: Montana, Utah, Alaska. You get used to weird sounds and animals. You don't run just because something scared you once. So I stayed. I kept the fire going most of the day, moved my gear closer, and sharpened both my knives. Around 4 in the afternoon, I smelled something, faint but wrong, like wet fur and old meat. Not skunk, not rot, just off. I couldn't find the source. It seemed to come and go with the wind. At dusk, I walked the edge of the lake and noticed something else. Movement on the opposite shore. A shape, human-sized, crouched near the water. I watched it for several minutes. It didn't move like a person, too low to the ground, twisted strangely, like it didn't have joints in the right places. Then it stood up and turned toward me. Even from across the lake, I could tell it wasn't right. Its arms were long, too long, legs bent the wrong direction, and its head was tilted in a way no neck should allow. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off it. Then I turned and went straight to camp. I built the fire higher than ever that night, flames nearly 4 feet tall. I kept the gun on my lap and sat with my back against a tree until my legs went numb. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, closer this time, and then I saw it. It stood just at the edge of the firelight, maybe 10 feet away. It was tall, taller than any man I've ever seen. Thin but not weak. There was strength in how it stood. Its skin looked stretched, like leather pulled tight over muscle. No hair, eyes deep set, lips too thin, and it moved like it was trying to remember how. I didn't shoot. I should have, maybe, but something told me not to. Not because I was scared to, because it wouldn't matter. It circled the camp slowly, just outside the light. Then it crouched, and I swear to God, it started mimicking animal sounds. First a bird, then a coyote, then something close to a human scream. Not quite, but close enough to twist my gut. Like someone trying to remember how to sound like a person. He said frozen. The thing never crossed the firelight. It just kept circling, twitching, making noises until the sky started to lighten. And then, just like that, it was gone. I left everything behind. I didn't even put out the fire. I just grabbed my pack and the gun and walked fast, then ran. I didn't stop for anything. I didn't even get back in the truck at first. I just kept walking down the road for 2 miles until I calmed down enough to think clearly. Then I doubled back, started the engine, and drove like hell back towards Spokane. I didn't tell anyone for months. And when I did, I only told my cousin Mark, the one who used to go to that lake with me when we were kids. He just nodded and said, "Uncle Ray was right to stop going." That's when I remembered the hunting trip Ray had gone on in '96. His buddy had gone missing near that same spot. Ray never said much, just that something wasn't right out there. I haven't been back since, and I won't go. There are things in the woods that don't care about people. They aren't ghosts. They aren't myths. They're just out there, waiting, watching, sometimes mimicking. And whatever it was that night, skinwalker or not, I know it remembered me, because every so often, I'll hear something outside my house late at night, a sound like twigs snapping, or footsteps in the leaves. And once, just once, I heard a scream, not quite human, not quite not, but I never go outside to check. Not anymore. My name is Trevor Morrison. I'm 34 now, but this happened back in 2018. I still think about it every few days, especially when I try to sleep. I had taken time off from my job at the time. I was working in an auto repair shop in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I didn't really have much planned that summer, but I wanted to get away from people for a while. Too much noise, too much work, too many people talking all the time. I didn't want to fly anywhere or stay at a hotel. I just wanted to disappear into the woods for a few days. I thought I could recharge. I didn't realize it would become the most disturbing experience of my life. I drove out to Arkansas toward the Ouachita Mountains. I had done a bit of backpacking before, nothing serious, but I knew how to set up a camp, build a fire, and all that. I picked a less popular trail, one of those that wasn't on the main websites, something I found through an old post on a camping forum. There were directions to a small clearing off a dirt road, then about a mile or two of hiking to a spot near a stream. The guy who posted it said it was peaceful and quiet. That was exactly what I wanted. I wrote the directions down, printed a map, and packed up for a 4-day solo camping trip. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just my coworker, Mark, and I told him I'd be back by Monday. I left early on a Friday morning. The drive took about 4 hours, including a stop for gas and some extra supplies. I had a cooler with food, water, snacks, and a few beers. I brought a 9mm handgun with me too. I always took it when I camped alone. Not because I was scared, but more out of habit. I wasn't expecting anything worse than maybe a snake or a raccoon. By the time I got to the trailhead, it was just past noon. It was a rough dirt road, barely wide enough for my truck, and it felt like it hadn't been used in a while. Weeds were growing right down the middle, and there were branches scraping the sides of the truck. I parked under some tall pine trees, far from any sign of civilization. There was no one else around, no cars, no buildings, not even a fence. I put on my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail was narrow, more like a deer path than a real trail. It wound through thick woods with pine needles and leaves covering most of the ground. I had to duck under low branches and step over rotting logs. Every so often, I'd see a small orange marker nailed to a tree, probably put there by some hunter or an old hiker group, but they were faded and far apart. It took me about 45 minutes to get to the spot. It was even better than I expected. There was a wide clearing by a stream, with enough flat ground for a tent and a fire. The trees formed a natural barrier around the space, and the sound of the water was calm and steady. I set up my tent facing the stream, laid out my gear, and built a small fire pit with rocks I found nearby. The sun was still up, but the shadows from the trees made it feel like late afternoon. I cooked some hot dogs on a small grill I brought, cracked open a beer, and sat on a log I dragged over near the fire. I didn't see or hear anyone else the entire time. No hikers, no campers, nothing. Just birds, wind, and the occasional splash of a fish in the stream. That first night was uneventful. I stayed up late, watching the fire and staring at the stars. When I crawled into my tent, it was quiet and cool. I fell asleep fast. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something moving. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like footsteps. I lay still, listening, not sure if I had imagined it. The steps were soft but heavy, not an animal scurrying, something bigger. I reached over and slowly unzipped my pack, feeling for the gun. I waited. After about a minute, the steps faded away. I didn't hear anything else. I stayed awake for another hour, just listening, but nothing came back. The next morning, I got out and looked around. There weren't any footprints I could see. Maybe it had been a deer, maybe a bear. Either way, it didn't mess with my camp. Everything was still in place. I had breakfast, did some light fishing in the stream, and took a nap in the afternoon. Around 4 p.m., I heard something again. This time, it was the sound of a branch breaking. Not just a crack, but a loud snap, like someone stepping on it with force. I stood up fast, looking toward the trees. I didn't see anything, but the sound was close, maybe 30 or 40 feet into the woods. I called out, thinking maybe someone had stumbled onto my camp. No one answered. I stayed alert for a while, watching that part of the woods, but nothing moved. I didn't hear anything else after that, so I chalked it up to another animal. Still, that night, I kept the fire going longer. I sat with the gun next to me, just in case. Around 10 p.m., I thought I saw movement in the trees again. Not something big, but like a shadow shifting between trunks. I got up and shone my flashlight around the perimeter. Nothing. The woods swallowed up the light a few feet in. I was tired, but I couldn't relax. I didn't sleep as well that night. Every small sound made me tense up. The third day was overcast and humid. I felt uneasy from the moment I woke up. It was like something was off, but I couldn't say what. The woods were too quiet. Even the birds weren't making much noise. Around noon, I decided I'd pack up the next morning instead of staying a full 4 days. I didn't feel good about the place anymore. That evening, I went to gather more firewood. I walked farther than usual, maybe 200 feet from my camp, following a line of fallen trees. That's when I found it. A pile of trash, half buried under leaves and branches. Old beer cans, a torn-up sleeping bag, wrappers, and a rusted cooking pot. There were boot prints nearby, too, not fresh but not old either. I crouched down and poked around with a stick. Some of the trash was damp, but some of it looked recently used. There was even a plastic water bottle with condensation still inside. I froze. Someone else had been camping out here recently, and they hadn't cleaned up. I backed away and returned to my camp fast, checking to see if anything had been touched. Nothing was missing, but I suddenly felt exposed. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't cook anything. I sat in the dark, holding my flashlight and my gun, listening to the woods. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer, much closer, and then a soft metallic clink, like something brushing against metal. I stayed inside the tent, my heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my ears. The steps circled around the tent slowly. I could barely breathe. Then silence. I don't know how long I waited. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. I didn't move. I didn't sleep at all. To first light, I packed everything up. I didn't even bother eating. I stuffed the tent, the gear, everything into my backpack and got moving. As I reached the start of the trail, I found something that stopped me cold. A shoe print in the mud, headed in the direction of my camp. Not mine. Too large, and fresher than the ones I saw earlier. I didn't stop walking until I saw my truck. I unlocked it, threw everything in the back, and drove out of there without looking back. I didn't calm down until I was back on a paved road. When I got home, I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe some squatter had been living out there. Maybe a hunter had wandered through. But the way those footsteps circled my tent, the way someone stayed out there without showing themselves, the trash pile, the silence. None of it sat right with me. Someone had been out there watching me. Someone who didn't want me to see them. I never reported it. I didn't have any proof. No one had technically done anything. But I never went camping alone again after that. And I always tell people, if you think you're alone out in the woods, you're probably wrong. Because someone knew I was out there. They watched me and they waited. And I still don't know what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I don't usually go camping alone, but that summer I needed to get away from everything. I'd been stuck in the same daily routine for what felt like years. Wake up, sit through traffic, stare at a screen for 8 hours, come home, repeat. My job in Denver was steady but numbing. At 33, I was in that gray area where I wasn't sure what I was working toward anymore. My friends were all either married with kids or grinding even harder in their careers. I felt stuck between both worlds, so I figured a few days out in nature could clear my head. I chose a spot in southwestern Wyoming, just inside the Bridger-Teton National Forest. I didn't want anything commercial or crowded, just a place I could hike into and set up on my own. No cell service, no people, just trees, mountains, maybe a few deer if I got lucky. I parked my car off a gravel service road that I'd marked on my map earlier, locked everything inside the trunk except what I'd carry in my backpack, and started hiking around 10 in the morning. The sun was already warming up the air, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The trail wasn't even a real trail, just an old, washed-out logging path that curved through dense pine forests and rolled over soft hills. It felt remote enough to keep other people away, but not so deep I'd get lost. I had a compass, an actual printed topo map, and extra batteries for my flashlight. I wasn't reckless, I just wanted solitude. By early afternoon, I'd gone about 4 miles in and found a clearing not far from a slow-moving creek. It wasn't wide, maybe the size of a basketball court, surrounded by thick pine on all sides with soft moss underfoot. You could barely see the sky from there, just bits of blue between the treetops. It felt protected, like a pocket hidden from the rest of the world. I pitched my tent under the shade, collected a bit of dry wood from the forest floor, and made a fire ring with stones. I boiled water for coffee using my little backpacking stove and sat on a log, letting the quiet settle in. There was nothing but the soft crack of branches in the breeze and the occasional rustle of squirrels. That first night, I didn't even light the fire. I ate some jerky, took a few notes in my journal, and climbed into my sleeping bag as the sky turned purple. But I barely slept. There's something about the woods at night when you're completely alone. Every sound feels amplified. Wind through the trees becomes footsteps. A snapping twig feels like a footfall. A screeching owl sounds like something dying. I had to keep reminding myself it was just nature doing its thing. Still, I slept with my flashlight in one hand and a knife tucked under the flap of my sleeping bag. The next morning, I got up at dawn, made instant oatmeal, and decided to do some exploring. I didn't want to go too far, just stretch my legs and see what was around. About a quarter mile west of camp, I came across an overgrown path that curved sharply downhill. It wasn't marked on my map, but it looked like it had been used at some point. Probably an old fire road or game trail. I followed it downhill for maybe 10 minutes until I noticed a faint smell. Something sour, like rotting food. I stopped and looked around, thinking maybe a raccoon or something had died nearby. The smell wasn't overwhelming, but it was sharp enough to stand out. I moved forward slowly, the air getting thicker with that scent the farther I went. It was the kind of smell you can feel in the back of your throat. 100 feet farther down the slope, the trees opened up into a narrow ravine. There was a rocky outcrop on one side and what looked like a flattened area covered with pine needles and leaves. Then I saw it. First, it looked like a pile of dirty clothes lying in the brush. Torn jeans, a gray hoodie twisted at the midsection. But something about the way it was positioned felt off, unnaturally stiff. I stepped closer. The smell was heavy now, sickly sweet and unmistakable. It was a body, face down, legs bent at weird angles. One sneaker was missing. The skin on the arms was dark and bloated, and flies swarmed in lazy circles above it. I couldn't tell how long it had been there, but it wasn't recent. Maybe a week, maybe more. I didn't get closer than I had to. I stood there for a full minute, not moving. My heart was hammering. My ears felt hot. I kept looking around the trees like someone else might be nearby, but there was nothing, no tracks, no gear, no backpack. Just this dead body in the middle of the woods. I backed away slowly, trying not to step on anything loud. I didn't want to panic, but my brain was spinning. I didn't have service. I couldn't call for help. My car was 4 miles away. The nearest ranger station was probably 20 or 30 miles beyond that. I felt completely cut off. Back at camp, I grabbed my pack and shoved everything inside. I doused the fire pit with water even though I hadn't lit anything. Every sound in the woods now felt like something watching me. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone stepping through the trees. I made it back to my car in record time, barely stopping for water. The whole hike back I kept thinking, what if whoever dumped that body is still out here? What if I saw something I wasn't supposed to? What if I left prints or dropped something? When I got back to my car, I locked the doors and drove like hell down that gravel road. Once I hit cell service, I pulled over and called the county sheriff's office. I didn't even care if they thought I was crazy. I told them what I saw, gave them the GPS coordinates as best as I could, and waited there until a deputy met me at a nearby rest area. They asked me a lot of questions. What time did I find the body? Did I touch anything? Did I see any signs of a struggle? I told them everything straight. I even walked them halfway back down the trail until the terrain started to match. They said they'd take it from there and asked me to stay available if they needed more info. I drove home that night, exhausted and wired at the same time. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the wheel. I didn't sleep when I got back to Denver. I couldn't stop thinking about the body, the way the limbs were twisted, the smell, the flies. I kept seeing it in my head. A few days later, they called me back. Turns out the body belonged to a guy named Nathan Castillo, 36 years old. Last seen in Salt Lake City about 3 weeks before I found him. He'd apparently told friends he was going on a solo camping trip, but never said where. No one reported him missing for almost 2 weeks. They think he might have been hiking and had some kind of accident. The coroner said the injuries looked consistent with a fall, broken ribs, fractured skull. But there was no way to tell for sure. The body had been exposed too long. Animals had gotten to parts of it. Still, there was no evidence of foul play.
No defensive wounds.
No sign he'd been robbed. His wallet was in his pocket. A few bills still folded up inside. It messed with me more than I thought it would. For weeks, I kept imagining myself in his place. What if I'd twisted an ankle on that slope and couldn't move? What if no one knew where I was? What if my body was left out there, face down in the pine needles, just waiting for some random hiker to find me? I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. Something about the silence felt different now. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the woods could swallow you up and no one would even know. But I also couldn't stop thinking about how lucky I was. If I'd hiked a different direction that day, I might never have seen him. If I'd left a day earlier or later, his body might have been washed away or buried by animals, and no one would have ever found out what happened to him. At least now, his family got to bury him. At least they got some kind of closure. Sometimes I still wonder what actually happened to him. Maybe he fell. Maybe he was running from something or someone. Maybe he just got lost and panicked and slipped. No one will ever really know. All I know is that for the rest of my life, When people talk about the peacefulness of nature or the freedom of the outdoors, I'll think about that day, about that ravine, about the stillness of the air and the stench of death hanging over the trees. And I'll remember that the woods don't care if you make it out or not. They don't mark the spot where you fall. They just keep growing. And if you're lucky, someone will be there to bring you home. Back in the fall of 2019, I took some time off work. I had just turned 32, and I'd been working non-stop since college.
No vacations. No breaks.
Just constant work in a small accounting office in central Ohio. I wasn't burned out, but I was tired of the routine. I didn't want to travel anywhere expensive or do anything too flashy. I just wanted to be away from people for a while. I packed up my car with my tent, sleeping bag, 2 coolers full of simple food, water jugs, a small camp stove, extra batteries, a couple flashlights, a folding chair, and some paperback books. My plan was to drive out of the city and find somewhere quiet where I could just camp for a few days without having to talk to anyone. I didn't care if it was legal camping land or not. I just wanted to be alone. That probably sounds dumb now, but I was tired and just didn't want to deal with people. A friend of mine from high school had mentioned an old farm that had been left empty somewhere out in southeastern Indiana, maybe an hour or so past Brookville. He told me it was off a side road off another side road, way out there, and nobody had lived there for decades. He said he and some buddies had camped there once in high school and never got bothered. It had a few structures left behind, including a collapsed barn and what was probably the old main house. That was all I needed to hear. I dropped a pin near where I thought it was and hit the road the next morning. The drive was peaceful. I took my time, played old music, and drank coffee from a beat-up thermos. I turned off the highway onto a 2-lane back road, then turned again onto a gravel road with overgrown ditches. I passed one mailbox at the very start of the gravel, but after that, there were no signs of anyone, just trees, brush, and silence. It took me about 20 minutes of slow driving before I saw what I was looking for. A rusted gate hanging crooked at the entrance of a driveway that was almost completely hidden by weeds. I pulled over, parked, and walked down the drive first to see if it was even worth bringing the car in. The path was bumpy but not impassable. Dead leaves crackled under my boots, and branches swiped at my shoulders as I moved. About 100 yards down the path, the trees opened into a wide, uneven clearing. It was exactly what I was hoping for. The remains of a barn stood to the left, mostly collapsed, its roof caved in and vines strangling what was left of the beams. The main house was straight ahead. It was a 2-story farmhouse, the kind you see in old movies, but it had been absolutely swallowed by time. Every window was shattered. The front steps were broken. One corner of the second floor had completely fallen in, and part of the roof was sagging like it could fall at any minute. It looked more like a giant pile of rotted boards than a house. There was a tiny tool shed near the barn that was still standing. It was a little crooked, but the door was intact and it looked dry inside. The whole place felt wrong, in that way that old forgotten places sometimes do, but I brushed it off. It was exactly what I wanted: quiet, remote, and long forgotten. I walked back to the car and drove it up slowly, bouncing over potholes and tree roots. I found a flattish spot near the edge of the clearing and set up camp about 50 feet from the house. I figured it was best to keep some distance just in case any part of it collapsed while I was sleeping. By late afternoon, I had my tent pitched, my food unpacked, and a small fire pit made from some loose bricks I found near the shed. I grilled a few hot dogs on my camp stove and sat in my folding chair with a book as the sun went down behind the trees. It got cold fast after dark. The fire helped a little, but by 9 I was zipped into my sleeping bag inside the tent, reading by flashlight. The first night passed quietly, and I slept well enough. The second day was uneventful. I walked the area a bit, being careful around the old structures. I peeked inside the farmhouse from a few feet back. Didn't go in. The floor was mostly rotted through, and you could see clear down into the basement in spots. Smelled like wet wood and old dirt. I figured animals had been living in there at some point, maybe raccoons or even coyotes. Still, there was something about the layout that made me pause. There were these gouges along the wall near the front door, like deep scrapes in the wood. Could have been from moving furniture, but they were at strange angles. I told myself it didn't matter and left it alone. Around noon, I found an old stone well out past the barn. The top was partially covered with a rusted metal grate. I tossed a rock in just to see if it still had water. Clinked off something halfway down, but I didn't hear a splash. There were small animal bones near the edge, maybe a rabbit or a squirrel. The whole thing creeped me out more than the house, so I avoided that area afterward. That night, I built another small fire and ate a can of chili. I was starting to feel a little uneasy. Not scared exactly, but that kind of feeling you get when you're alone in a place that hasn't seen people in years. I hadn't seen a single car or person since I arrived. No cell service either, which I had expected, but it still added to the isolation. Just after midnight, I woke up to a noise. Not loud, more like a sharp crunch. At first I thought maybe a branch had fallen. I stayed still and listened. Then I heard it again, closer. It sounded like someone or something walking through the clearing. The steps were slow, and they moved with intention, not like a deer or raccoon. I turned off my flashlight and stayed completely still. The steps got closer. I could hear the dry grass being flattened. Then nothing. 10 minutes passed. 20. Nothing. Eventually, I fell back asleep with my hand gripping the flashlight like a weapon. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. Everything looked normal.
No footprints.
No damage. I checked my car, still locked. I assumed it was just an animal, maybe a big one. That third day, I wandered further into the woods behind the barn. There was a broken fence line, and beyond that, some kind of path almost completely overgrown. I followed it for maybe half a mile. It wound through thick brush until it opened into a smaller clearing that had another structure, what looked like an old livestock building or smokehouse. The air was different there, heavy, like a storm was coming, even though the sky was clear. There were broken tools in the grass, a rusted saw, a shovel with a snapped handle, and a pile of old clothing that looked like it had been there for decades. Torn flannel, a pair of jeans, boots with cracked leather. I didn't touch anything. I didn't want to. That night, the noises came back. But this time, they didn't stop. I heard walking again, slow steps around the edge of the clearing. Not close enough to see clearly, but too close for comfort. I peeked through the flap of the tent and saw a shape standing near the house. It wasn't moving, just standing. I couldn't tell what it was. No flashlight, no sound, just a dark figure. I turned off my light and waited. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I peeked out, it was still there. By sunrise, it was gone. I stepped outside the tent and checked everything again. Still locked, still intact. But I found something new on the ground near the fire pit. A shoe, not mine, muddy and torn. I stared at it for a long time. It looked old, but it hadn't been there the day before. I would have seen it. It was right where I'd been sitting. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could. Stuffed the tent in the trunk without folding it. Didn't even eat. Just got in the car and drove. As I backed out of the clearing, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. Someone stepping out of the doorway of the farmhouse. I didn't look back. I just kept driving until I hit pavement again and got far enough for cell service to come back. I didn't report anything. I didn't want to explain why I'd been camping on someone else's land. I didn't want to get into trouble, but I think about that place a lot. Whoever or whatever was out there had been watching me. Not just walking by, watching. They knew where I was. They left things for me to find. They were trying to tell me something or scare me out. And it worked. I never went camping alone again after that. Now, 5 years later, I looked up the property out of curiosity. Turns out the land was never actually abandoned. The farmhouse had belonged to a family in the 60s, and 2 of the kids had gone missing back in 71. They searched for weeks, found nothing. The place was sold cheap in the 80s, but nobody ever moved in. It changed hands a few more times after that. Now it's listed as private property, owned by some LLC that doesn't even have a real name. No phone number, no email, just a P.O. box in Kentucky. Whoever owns it now, I hope they know what's out there. I sure do, and I'm never going back. It was July of 2016. I was 34 then, and I had taken a 2-week solo trip through the southern countryside of France. My name's Oliver, and I'm originally from northern England, but I'd been living in Marseille for about 6 years at that point, working freelance jobs, mostly photography and some light writing work for travel blogs. I'd gotten used to moving around a lot on foot or by bike. Sometimes I'd hitch rides or take the train when I needed to cover bigger distances, but most of the time, I preferred being out in the woods, walking the quiet paths and sleeping under the trees. It gave me time to think, kept my head clear. That summer, I planned to camp around the Cévennes National Park. It's a massive area with rough hills, forests, open plateaus, and winding rivers. You can walk for miles without seeing another person, especially if you get off the main trails, which I always did. I had no problem being alone for days. I liked the silence, the rhythm of moving from place to place. I kept a journal, took photos, and cooked simple meals over a small camp stove. That day, I'd hiked up through a narrow stretch of woodland just south of the Lazare department. I'd marked a small clearing on the map the night before, a little flat patch of ground surrounded by thick pine trees, far from any official campsites or even secondary trails. It looked quiet, private, perfect. I reached it in the early evening. I was tired from walking most of the day, and my shoulders were sore from the pack. The clearing wasn't large, just big enough for a 1-person tent and a spot to sit. I set up camp right in the middle, facing west so I could watch the last light through the trees. There was no wind. The air was still. The woods around me were quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds. It wasn't exactly eerie, but it stood out to me. Normally, you'd hear at least something. I figured it was just the time of day or maybe the elevation. I laid out my gear, made a simple dinner, pasta and lentils, then jotted some notes in my journal. Just observations about the land, the trees, how dry everything felt. I didn't have a signal on my phone, which wasn't unusual out there. I usually turned it off anyway to save battery. After the sun dipped behind the hills, I crawled into the tent, zipped up, and read a bit until it got dark. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not suddenly, not with panic. Just slowly opened my eyes like I hadn't really been asleep at all. Couldn't tell why. The air inside the tent was cold. Colder than it had been when I'd gone to bed. I listened for a while. Nothing. No wind, no animals, not even an insect buzzing. Just silence. Then I heard a twig snap. It wasn't close. It was maybe 15, 20 meters away, but it wasn't just a random noise. It was too sharp, too clean, like someone stepped on a branch with purpose. I laid still, holding my breath. My tent's rainfly was down, so I couldn't see out, but I turned slowly and reached for the folding knife I kept near my sleeping pad. I held it in my hand and listened. I didn't hear anything else for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. Eventually, I relaxed a little. I figured it was an animal, probably a deer or a wild boar. They moved through the woods at night. It wasn't unusual. Still, something about the sound felt careful, measured. I must have drifted off again because I woke up later to light. Early morning, pale sunlight coming through the trees. Everything looked normal. I got out, stretched, and walked around the edge of the clearing. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual, but something had been near the tent. I could tell by the way the needles on the ground were slightly disturbed. Not in a wide circle, but just a single narrow path, like someone had walked past, slow and deliberate, in a straight line. That stuck in my head. I tried to shrug it off. I broke camp, packed up, and headed out, sticking to a route that would bring me through a lower part of the forest near a stream where I planned to rest for lunch. I didn't see anyone that morning. No hikers, no animals, just trees and sunlight. I kept thinking about the path around the tent, the way it didn't curve or wander. It went straight past the tent, maybe only 5 meters out, like someone walked by and kept going, not stopping, not veering off, just passing through. That night, I camped near the stream, closer to a marked trail. I wanted to be near water and also near a way out, just in case. Again, it was quiet, too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, dead quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I tried not to think about it. I cooked, I wrote in my journal, I slept. In the early hours, I had a dream, or I thought it was a dream. I was standing outside the tent, barefoot, watching the trees. The moon was above the treetops, pale and still. I felt cold, and the forest felt wrong. Then I saw her, a woman. She was maybe 50 meters away, standing between 2 trees. I couldn't make out her face clearly, but I saw her clothes. A long gray dress, muddy at the bottom, and something over her head. Maybe a scarf, maybe tangled hair. She didn't move. She didn't look away. She just stood there, watching. I woke up inside the tent, sweating. My heart was beating fast. I sat up, unzipped the flap, and looked outside. Nothing, just trees and soft moonlight. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Whether I had sleepwalked or hallucinated or just dreamed the whole thing, it didn't matter. I had seen her, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods anymore. The next few days were harder. I started hearing more noises at night. More twigs breaking, more footsteps, always from different directions. Never close enough to see anyone, but close enough to feel watched. My sleep got worse. I stopped cooking dinner, just ate dry food so I didn't have to light a flame. I moved campsites more often, trying not to stay in one place too long. Then one afternoon, as I was hiking through a narrow gorge lined with steep pines, I came across something that stopped me cold. A pile of clothes, folded neatly on a flat rock. Women's clothes. A dress, pale blue and worn thin, laid out like someone had taken it off carefully and left it there. Next to it was a small glass jar filled with dead flowers. I didn't touch any of it. I didn't even get that close. I stood there, frozen, staring at it. Something about the way it was arranged felt deliberate, like a message or a warning. I backed away and kept moving. I hiked until the sun was nearly gone, then made camp in a small dip in the land between some boulders. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat outside the tent with my knife in my hand, waiting. Sometime after midnight, I saw her again. This time, she was closer, maybe 20 meters away, standing just past the boulders, partly hidden in the trees. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her looking at me. Her arms were hanging loose at her sides, and her head was slightly tilted. She didn't move. She didn't blink. I didn't move either. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, she turned and walked away. Not rushed, just calm, smooth steps into the trees until she disappeared. I packed up before the sun rose. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I moved quickly, hiking nonstop for nearly 8 hours, finally reaching a small road that led to a village. I stayed in a cheap room above a cafe, slept for 12 straight hours, and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. That maybe the stress, the isolation, the lack of sleep had gotten to me. But when I checked my journal the next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. On the last page, under my notes about the clothes on the rock, someone had written something in small, shaky letters. "She sees you." It wasn't my handwriting. I hadn't written it. I hadn't even opened the journal since the day before. I don't know when it was added. I don't know how. I left France a few days later, took a train to Lyon, then flew back to England. I stopped camping for almost 2 years. I still go outdoors now, but never alone. Never far from a road. Never without checking who's nearby. And I never write in journals anymore. Even now, almost a decade later, I still think about her. About that face I couldn't see. About the way she stood. The silence around her. The glass jar. The message. I know what I saw. I know it was real. And I know she's still out there. Waiting. Watching. I was 33 that year, and I'd been working a desk job for nearly a decade. Customer service, mostly. Staring at screens and replying to emails about shipping delays and wrong item orders. It wasn't hard, just soul-numbing. That spring, I started feeling a bit sick of everything. No big breakdown or anything, just that nagging, dull thought that life was passing me by while I sat still. So I booked a week off work, bought some gear I didn't really need, and planned a solo camping trip out to the hills near Hemlock Ridge in northern Arkansas. I'd driven through that area a couple times before, years ago, and remembered the place being quiet and green, with endless woods and not a whole lot of people. That was exactly what I wanted. It was early May. I figured the weather would be warm enough to sleep under the stars, but still cool enough to enjoy hiking during the day. I left Little Rock early one Monday morning and drove north with the back of my SUV loaded up. Tent, sleeping bag, cooler, gas stove, a couple of lanterns, and enough dried food to last me 5 days. I'd even brought one of those little folding camp toilets and biodegradable bags just to avoid dealing with random holes in the dirt. It felt like overkill at the time, but by the end, I was glad I had it. The area I'd picked to camp in wasn't part of a developed campground. I wasn't really into the idea of pitching a tent 30 feet away from someone else's RV while their kids blasted music from a Bluetooth speaker. I wanted to be alone, off the beaten trail. So I used some old Forest Service maps and picked a spot a couple miles into the woods, along an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. It ended near the base of a long, shallow ridge. From there, a narrow path went up into the trees. The higher it went, the rockier it got. Not many people hiked it anymore, at least not from that side. I parked at the end of the road and hiked about a mile up, with my tent and supplies in a backpack that probably weighed way more than it should have. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the whole area smelled like wet bark and cold earth. There were birds everywhere, and the only sounds I could hear were wind in the trees and my own footsteps crunching through the leaves. It was perfect. I set up camp on a flattish area about halfway up the ridge. The slope wasn't steep there, just a gentle rise, and there was a small break in the trees that let in a little more light. I had a view of the woods below, and through a gap in the trees, I could see part of the logging road I'd come in on. There were no tire tracks besides mine. The last time anyone had probably been through that way was months ago, maybe longer. The first 2 days were quiet. I hiked around, cooked simple meals, made a fire, read for a bit, and just let my brain go quiet for the first time in what felt like years. It rained a little on the second night, just a light sprinkle, but my tent held up fine. I stayed dry and warm and fell asleep to the sound of water tapping gently against the nylon above me. On the third day, clouds started to roll in. I checked the weather forecast on my phone. Barely had any signal, but a page loaded just enough to show a severe thunderstorm warning for the region. That made me pause for a second. The clouds were darker than before, and I could smell that strange, electric scent that sometimes shows up before heavy rain. I decided to stay put anyway. I had gear that could handle storms. My tent was a good one, double-layered, waterproof, rated for bad weather. I'd staked it down well, and I'd set it up away from low ground so I wouldn't get flooded. The trees around me were tall, but not so close that one would fall on me unless something extreme happened. I felt ready. Around 5 that evening, it started coming down hard. The wind picked up fast, branches swayed, and the canopy above me shook like waves. I scrambled to put everything loose back in the tent or inside my gear bags. Rain whipped sideways. Thunder cracked sharp and loud above the ridge. I sat inside the tent with the rainfly zipped tight, headlamp on, and listened to the storm rage for hours. Around 9, the thunder died down, but the rain didn't stop, kept going steady and cold. Water streamed past my tent in little channels. I checked the corners for leaks, and everything was still dry. I laid down and tried to sleep. I didn't get much. Sometime after midnight, I heard a sound that wasn't rain. At first, I thought it was part of the storm, branches falling, maybe, but then I heard it again. It was sharper, quieter, something like the sound of metal being tapped. I sat up, heart thumping harder than it should have been. I turned off my headlamp to listen. The tent was sealed up, so I couldn't see anything outside, but the sound came again, this time closer. It was quick, like someone tapped a metal pipe once, then again. 2 soft taps, then silence. The kind of sound you almost think you imagined until you hear it again. I didn't move for at least 5 minutes. My heart was racing, but I told myself it had to be something stupid. Rocks sliding, maybe a deer stepping on a can or old junk left behind. But it didn't feel like that. I knew what forest sounds were like. I'd heard plenty of raccoons and squirrels and even deer stepping through leaves. This felt different. When I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the door a little and peek out with my flashlight, I didn't see anything. Just trees and rain and darkness. I stepped out, slowly, and turned the light in a full circle. Nothing. I checked around the camp just to be sure. No tracks, no signs of anything having been there. I was soaked by the time I got back inside the tent, and my hands were shaking. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, everything was drenched. My boots were wet. My jacket was wet. I ate a granola bar in silence and didn't even make coffee. I just sat there and thought about that sound. 2 taps, metal on metal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been random. I packed up most of my gear by noon. I wasn't planning to leave early, but something felt wrong. The storm had eased into light rain again, and though the sky was still gray, the worst of it had passed. I figured I could hike back down to the road and sleep in the SUV for the night. But as I was taking down the tent, I saw something. About 20 feet away, off the side of the path where I hadn't looked closely before, I noticed what looked like an old trail marker nailed to a tree. It was rusty, half buried in moss, and didn't look like any official marker I'd seen before. Just a thin strip of metal square, no writing on it. It was bent, like something had hit it or pulled at it. I walked over to check it out, and when I stepped around the tree, I saw what I thought was a pile of old wood. It wasn't. It was a homemade hunting blind, half collapsed, covered in brush. Old tarps, sticks, and what looked like chicken wire. Someone had built it to blend in. It was crude but functional. A small hole in the front for viewing. Inside was a broken lawn chair, some old plastic wrappers, and a beer can. None of it looked fresh, maybe a year old. But then I noticed the ground nearby was disturbed. Mud churned up. Someone had been standing there recently, and in the mud, I saw the faint outline of a boot print. Big, deep. It wasn't mine. That shook me a little. The whole point of picking this ridge was that nobody came out here. I'd seen no signs of anyone for miles, and now I had evidence that someone had not only been here recently, but had watched from a blind, hidden in the woods less than 30 feet from my tent. I packed the rest of my gear in a panic. I didn't even roll the tent properly, just shoved it in the bag. My hands were clumsy, cold. Every sound in the forest made me flinch. A squirrel jumping from a branch made me stumble backward. I was completely on edge. I hiked down with the rain still falling lightly. The trail was slick and I nearly slipped twice. I kept turning around, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was no one. When I reached the SUV, I unlocked it fast, tossed my gear in, and slammed the doors. I sat there, soaked and shaking, and locked all the doors. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat and listened. Somewhere up the ridge, I heard something move. It was faint. Maybe a branch cracking, maybe just my brain inventing things. But I didn't wait to find out. I drove down that muddy road faster than I should have. Wheels skidding in spots, windshield wipers smearing dirt and water. I didn't stop until I was back on pavement, heading south toward the nearest town. I ended up checking into a cheap motel outside Jasper that night. Everything in the room smelled like mildew, but I didn't care. I peeled off my wet clothes, sat on the bed in silence, and stared at the wall for over an hour. That night, I slept with the lights on. I never did go back to Hemlock Ridge. I never reported what I saw. There wasn't anything illegal about it, not really. Maybe someone had been hunting. Maybe they'd set up that blind and just forgotten about it. But the fresh boot print in the mud, the metal tapping sound in the storm, the feeling of being watched, it didn't feel like coincidence. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, never off trail, and never without a way to leave quickly. Whatever or whoever was up on that ridge that night didn't make a move. They didn't hurt me, they didn't take anything, but they were there. I know they were, and I still wonder sometimes if I hadn't heard that sound, if I hadn't checked, if I'd stayed one more night, would I have made it out at all? I was 32 when I decided to take a break from everything and go camping alone in Tennessee. It was late October of 2017. The weather had just started to turn cold, but not enough to keep people from going outside. I had recently left my job at a logistics company in Pittsburgh after years of feeling boxed in by fluorescent lights and pointless meetings. I didn't tell anyone except my sister that I was leaving town. I just packed my gear, loaded up my old gray Toyota Tacoma, and headed south. I didn't plan every detail of the trip. I just knew I wanted solitude, real quiet, somewhere off the grid but not so remote I'd end up in trouble with no way out. I did a lot of online searching and settled on a section of land near Bear Ridge, not far from the Cherokee National Forest. It wasn't an official campsite. It was one of those old Forest Service roads that cuts deep into the mountains and then just ends. The kind you could miss if you blinked while driving. I found it on a forum about dispersed camping. Some guy had posted GPS coordinates and said he'd spend a weekend there alone and didn't see another soul. That sounded perfect to me. The drive down was long. I took I-81 through Virginia and dropped into Tennessee just past Bristol. I stopped at a gas station and filled up the truck. I bought a bag of beef jerky, a few gallons of water, and a can of bear spray just to be safe. I already had my tent, sleeping bag, food, propane stove, a hand crank radio, and a Ruger LCR .38 I kept in a side holster in my bag. Not because I expected anything to happen, but because I believed in being prepared. The turnoff to the forest road came after about 3 hours of winding back roads. It wasn't marked. There was just a wooden post that had been sawed off halfway, splinters sticking up like old bone. I turned in, checked my tires on the gravel, and followed the road until the trees got dense and the sun started to break through less and less. It felt like I was entering a tunnel of green and gray. Eventually, the road just stopped. It opened into a clearing surrounded by trees on all sides. To my right, Maybe 50 yards away, I noticed the steep edge of a ravine. It dropped sharply, probably 200 feet or more. I couldn't see the bottom, but I could hear water way down there if I listened long enough. A fast stream or river, maybe. That's where I decided to set up. I parked the truck to face outward in case I needed to leave quickly. I set up my tent about 20 feet from the edge of the ravine and dragged over a few large stones to make a fire ring. I collected dry sticks, checked them for insects, and started a small fire. I boiled some water, made instant noodles, and sat on a stump I found half buried in pine needles. The air was crisp, clean, and just cold enough that it kept you awake. The trees were tall, older than anything I'd seen back in Pennsylvania. Oaks, sycamores, and hickories packed close, their leaves already halfway fallen. I spent the first night just soaking it all in. It was quiet the way only deep woods are. You hear everything out there, not just the owls or the occasional rustle in the leaves, but the distant groans of trees moving in the wind, the sharp cracking of branches falling, the sound of insects still buzzing even in the cold. I didn't sleep much that first night. I lay in my tent, listening, making mental notes of every sound and which direction it came from. I'm not usually jumpy, but there's something about being out there alone, far from cell service and lights, that sharpens you. Every small noise makes your brain guess at possibilities. The second day, I took a long hike down a trail that curved behind the ravine and looped through some dense forest. I brought my compass and checked it frequently, but the trail was pretty easy to follow. I didn't see anyone else, not even signs of other hikers. No rappers, no cigarette butts, no old footprints. That was both comforting and unsettling. On the way back, around 3 in the afternoon, I saw something strange. About a mile from my camp, I noticed an old trail that branched off from the main one. It wasn't obvious unless you were really looking. The leaves and brush had mostly covered it, but you could still see where the earth had been packed down long ago. Curiosity got the best of me, so I followed it. It led to an old wooden structure, just a small shack, maybe 10 by 12 feet. The wood was weathered to the point where it looked gray and brittle. No windows, just a door hanging sideways on one hinge. There were metal barrels outside, rusted and half sunk into the soil. One had holes drilled in the side like it had been used as a burn barrel. A pile of bones, maybe animal, deer or raccoon, was scattered near it. Some clean, some not. That made my stomach tighten. I'm no stranger to nature. I've hunted. I field-dressed deer. But this didn't feel like that. The cuts weren't clean. Some bones had dried sinew and fur still clinging to them. One still had a bit of rope around the joint. I didn't go inside the shack. I didn't even get close. I took a quick look, turned around, and followed my trail back. I didn't run, but I walked fast. My heart thumped the whole time, and I kept looking over my shoulder. Nothing followed me, no sounds, just that heavy silence. I reached camp around 5, and by then the sun was already low. I didn't cook that night. I just drank some water and sat near the fire with my jacket zipped up to my chin, bear spray in one hand, the gun closer than usual. That night I barely slept. Around 1 a.m., I heard something. Not a rustle or a crack, but a thump. Heavy, like a footstep on soft ground. Then silence. Another thump. Closer. I sat up in my sleeping bag, completely still. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I just sat, breathing through my nose, listening. After maybe 30 seconds of silence, I heard something move again. But this time, it wasn't a thump. It was the unmistakable sound of fabric scraping, like a bag being dragged. Then a low metallic clink. I didn't move. I waited over an hour before I dared to peek outside. When I finally did, I didn't see anything. The fire had long since gone out. My truck was there, my gear undisturbed. But near the fire ring, something was different. A trail. A faint drag mark in the pine needles and dirt, maybe a foot wide, leading from the direction of the woods to the fire pit, and then stopping. It didn't go back. I spent the next day deciding if I should leave. I felt watched. I felt like something had changed the moment I found that shack. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I convinced myself that it was an animal, or maybe a hunter who had stumbled into the wrong clearing. Maybe they saw the fire, got curious, and left. I told myself a lot of things. That afternoon, I went down near the ravine's edge, thinking about moving the tent farther back. That's when I saw it. Something shiny, wedged between two rocks halfway down the slope. I used my small binoculars to check. It was a metal canister like an old thermos. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't mine. I climbed down carefully, using roots and narrow ledges to keep from sliding. It took me about 20 minutes to reach the spot. When I got there, I saw that it wasn't a thermos at all. It was an old military-style container, olive green with a rusted latch. I pried it open. Inside were photos. Dozens of old Polaroids, most of them water-damaged and faded. But a few were still legible. They were of people. Some looked posed. Others didn't. One showed a man sitting against a tree, hands behind his back, head slumped. Another was of a tent like mine, same shape, same color, taken from the tree line at night. The worst one was a photo of a campsite with a fire burning and a man lying just outside the tent flap. Not sleeping, his neck twisted at a bad angle. I felt cold all over. My mouth was dry. I put the photos back, closed the canister, and left it there. I didn't want to touch them again. I climbed back up, scraping my hands and knees more than once, and when I got back to camp, I packed everything. Fast. Tent, stove, bag, all of it shoved into the truck bed with no real order. I left the fire ring and the stacked stones. I didn't care anymore. I started the truck and drove back down that forest road, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and I didn't stop after that either. I drove all the way to a motel in Greenville, walked into the lobby covered in dirt and pine needles, and paid for a room in cash. I stayed there 2 nights before heading home. I never called the Rangers. I didn't report the shack. I didn't even tell my sister the full story. Just said I got spooked and left early. I know that's probably not the right thing to do, but something in me felt like I wasn't supposed to have seen any of it. Like I'd stumbled into something meant to stay buried. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about those photos sometimes. I wonder who took them. I wonder how long they'd been down there, sitting in that canister halfway down the ravine. I wonder who else found that shack and what they saw or didn't see. Every so often, I check forums about that area. I look up missing persons in Tennessee. I haven't found anything that connects directly, but I've seen new posts about Bear Ridge. People still go there. Some say it's peaceful. Some say they heard strange noises. One guy wrote that he found old bones and thought they might be human. I didn't comment. I've learned to leave some things alone. It was late October 2016 when I decided to do something strange and quiet with my weekend. I was 34 at the time, single, and had taken a few days off from my job doing plumbing repair work around southern Kentucky. I had been stressed. Too many calls, too many nights in cheap motels, too many arguments with angry landlords who didn't want to pay what they owed. I needed to unplug. I needed quiet. No people, no phones, no voices. Just open air and space. I had this idea that started as a joke when I was driving past a small cemetery about an hour north of Bowling Green. It sat right behind a church that hadn't been used in years. No glass in the windows. The wooden sign out front faded so badly the letters were unreadable. The place wasn't fenced, and it had no lights. The road next to it was narrow, empty, with just enough shoulder to park if you weren't picky. I remember thinking to myself, no one goes here, and the idea hit me like that. I could camp there. It sounded stupid at first, but the more I thought about it, the better it sounded. A graveyard was probably the most peaceful place I could pick. No kids.
No ateversus.
No campfires from teenagers. It was private, out of the way, and had enough trees around to stay hidden. I camped in worse places. Once behind a Walmart in Georgia. Another time under a bridge when I misjudged my route and had no daylight left. This was just another spot. More unusual. Sure, but no worse. I packed light. Just a tent, a sleeping bag, my heavy-duty flashlight, a small cooler with some water and sandwiches, and a camping knife I always kept on me. I left my phone in the glove box. I didn't want texts or social media. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going. That part wasn't smart, but I didn't care. I drove up there just before dark. The road was empty. That time of year, the leaves were already falling, covering the shoulder where I pulled over. I parked halfway into the brush, locked the truck, and grabbed my gear. The church was maybe 50 yards from the road, and the graveyard stretched behind it. Old headstones, scattered trees, and patches of grass that had gone yellow and dry. No path, no signs. I walked past the church, through the overgrown weeds, and picked a spot on the far edge of the cemetery. There was a broken-down chain-link fence back there, half covered by brush. It looked like someone had tried to mark the boundary once, but never finished. That whole section of the graveyard looked forgotten, like no one had touched it in decades. That was perfect. I set up the tent under a crooked tree. The roots were thick and stuck out of the ground like veins, so I had to clear a space just big enough for the tent to sit flat. I laid my sleeping bag out, stuck my knife in the soft earth beside me, and sat back on the edge of the tent flap with my sandwich and a bottle of water. The air was cool. Dead leaves shifted with every breeze. It was quiet, completely silent except for the sound of wind. That part was actually nice. For a while, I just sat there looking at the stones. Some of them were nothing more than square blocks, no names left to read. Others had worn carvings, mostly from the early 1900s. I saw one that said 1897. Another one, cracked down the center, had a child's name on it, only lived to age 4. That one got to me a little. The idea that someone buried a child out here more than 100 years ago, and now nobody remembered them.
No flowers.
No visitors. Just dry grass and dead leaves piling up every fall. Around 9 o'clock, I got in my tent and zipped it closed. The moonlight was bright enough that I didn't need a flashlight. It lit the canvas from outside with a soft silver glow. I lay there in my bag, head on a rolled-up hoodie, listening to the wind push through the trees. That first hour passed without much thought. My mind wandered. I kept telling myself this was exactly what I needed. No calls, no one asking where I was, just dirt, trees, and cold air. But right before I started to drift off, I heard something, like a light crunching noise in the brush. At first I ignored it, probably a raccoon or an armadillo. I'd heard those before, but it didn't go away. It was slow, step by step, then silence, then another step. Not a scurry, not the kind of sound animals make. This was deliberate, even. I unzipped the tent just an inch and looked out. The wind had died down. The leaves weren't moving. I didn't see anything at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed a shape, small, low to the ground, just past the broken fence near the tree line. It wasn't moving, just crouched there. I stayed still. My hand found the knife. After maybe 10 seconds, the shape turned and moved away. No sound, no panic, just disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat upright in the tent with the knife across my lap until the first light hit the sky. Every sound after that made me freeze. A branch falling, a breeze pushing leaves. I must have held my breath for hours. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or maybe a dog. The way it crouched didn't make sense, but I couldn't explain it, and that made it worse. When morning came, I unzipped the tent, stepped out into the cold, and checked the spot where I saw it. The leaves were scattered, no prints that I could see. The broken fence was still there, bent in the same place, but now I noticed something else. Beyond the fence, where the trees thickened, there was a narrow trench, almost like an old path, dug shallow into the dirt. It curved around behind the church and disappeared into the woods. I'd missed it the night before. I followed it with my eyes, then walked a little closer. The path wasn't made by water or animals. It looked like someone had taken a shovel and scraped along the same route over and over. There were marks in the dirt, flat blade impressions. Not new, but not old either. And there were pieces of wood, thin planks, broken, splintered, mostly buried but still sticking out. I don't know why I did it, but I dropped to one knee and pulled at one of the boards. It was soft, half-rotted, but I could see nails in it. The head of a rusty nail caught the light. Then I saw a second piece of wood angled, and a third. It was a box that had been buried and pulled out. Long, narrow, and empty. That was when the weight hit my stomach. It wasn't a shed. It wasn't garbage. It was a casket, a child-sized casket, torn open, dragged through the dirt. I backed away. My hands were shaking. Who the hell does something like that? And why here where no one visits? I didn't think twice. I walked straight back to the tent, grabbed my pack, stuffed everything in without folding it, and headed toward the truck. I kept checking the trees. Every second I was out there, I felt watched. It wasn't fear like a movie. It was worse. It was the kind where your body tightens and your instincts scream that you're not supposed to be there. When I reached the road, I saw something else. My truck, my goddamn truck, had mud streaks on the side that weren't there before. Not from driving, from fingers. 5 long streaks right down the passenger door, like someone had pressed a muddy hand there and slid it down slowly. I opened the door, heart racing, and checked the inside. Everything was where I left it. The glove box was untouched, but the dust on the driver's side mat was disturbed, like someone had sat in my seat and got out. There were boot marks, small, narrow. I left fast, slammed the door, turned the key, and drove down that road without looking back. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The shape, the casket, the trench, the muddy hand on the truck. It all made sense in the worst way. Someone had been coming there at night, digging, opening old graves. For what reason, I didn't know, but it wasn't curiosity. It was something dark, quiet, wrong. I never called the police. I thought about it, but what would I say? That I camped illegally in a graveyard and saw a shadow? That I dug up part of a buried casket and ran away? They wouldn't take it seriously. Maybe they'd find me. Maybe they'd send someone out, find nothing, and move on. But I know what I saw. I know I wasn't alone out there. And I know someone used that graveyard for something no one should. That's why I never went back. Now it's been almost 10 years. I still think about it sometimes, especially at night. Every once in a while, I'll have a dream where I'm back in that tent, staring out the flap, and the shape isn't in the distance anymore. It's standing right in front of me. Not a monster, not a ghost, just a man, a real man, watching, waiting, covered in dirt. I always wake up sweating, and I never camp near graveyards anymore, ever. In the summer of 2016, I was 29 years old and living in Ohio. I had taken a week off work to get away from everything for a while. My job at the time was working as a logistics coordinator at a warehouse distribution center just outside of Dayton, and to be honest, the stress had been building up for months. I was the kind of person who usually kept to myself, and after years of back-to-back 10-hour shifts and rotating weekends, I realized I needed to slow down before something gave out. I wasn't really one for big vacations or flying places. What I liked was nature, space, and quiet. I decided to spend the week camping solo. I'd done it a few times before, mostly in local forests or state parks. That time, I wanted something a bit more off the grid. A friend of mine from high school, who I hadn't talked to in years but was still friends with on social media, had once posted photos of a little-known quarry turned lake somewhere in Ross County. It looked remote and untouched, with trees hugging the jagged stone walls and clear greenish water in the middle. I messaged him months before asking where it was, and he told me it was off an old service road south of Chillicothe. It was apparently used by a mining company back in the 80s but had been abandoned for decades. No official trails, no signs, no real paths, just locals who knew about it. That sounded perfect. I packed up my gear in my old Ford Escape: tent, sleeping bag, cooler with ice packs, water jugs, propane burner, basic food, a knife, bear spray, and a cheap .22 pistol my uncle had given me a few years earlier. I'd only fired it a handful of times. Ohio isn't known for bear activity, but you never know with coyotes or people out in the woods. I also brought my small folding camp shovel, a first aid kit, and one of those rechargeable lanterns that can run all night. My phone was fully charged, and I had 2 portable battery packs. I didn't expect service out there anyway. The morning I left, the weather was warm, dry, and sunny. I hit the highway around 10 a.m., stopped for some extra firewood in Chillicothe, and then drove another hour into a maze of back roads that twisted through thick hills and farmland. My GPS dropped out not long after turning off the paved roads, but I had printed directions from Google Maps the night before. After a few wrong turns and doubling back once or twice, I finally found the narrow dirt road the guy had mentioned. It looked more like a dry creek bed than a road, rutted with tire tracks and barely wide enough for my SUV. I drove slowly, bumping over rocks and past trees that leaned into the path like they hadn't seen a car in years. After about 15 minutes, the road opened up a bit, and the tree line broke just enough to reveal the top edge of the quarry. It was beautiful, a wide, deep pit carved into the earth, maybe 200 feet across, with steep stone walls all around and that still, glassy water in the center. I couldn't see any signs of human activity. No trash, no fire rings, no footprints. Just birds overhead and the hum of bugs in the heat. I found a flat patch of ground off to the east side of the quarry, about 30 feet from the edge. The ground was dry and soft enough for tent stakes, shaded by some tall oaks that gave just enough breeze. I spent the first hour setting up camp, pitching the tent, organizing my food, digging a small fire pit. I made a mental note of where I'd parked, which was about 100 yards up the hill behind me. I didn't want to hike in too far, just in case something happened. I liked the idea of being alone, but I wasn't reckless. That first afternoon was peaceful. I swam a bit in the quarry, though I didn't go too deep. The water was cold even in the summer sun, and it dropped off quickly. I could see the steep walls curving downward under the surface. I fished a little, didn't catch anything, and then spent most of the evening just listening to the quiet.
No traffic sounds, no planes overhead.
Just wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a branch falling somewhere deeper in the woods. I built a fire that night, heated some canned chili, and sat there until the stars came out. I didn't hear anything strange. No animals circling the tent, no distant howls, nothing. I fell asleep to the sound of frogs and crickets. The second day was when things started to feel off. I woke up just after sunrise, stretched, and walked down to the quarry with my camp mug to rinse it out. That's when I noticed the footprints. Not mine. They were barefoot, at least one set, maybe two, pressed clearly into the soft dirt between the tree line and the water's edge. The toes were splayed out wide, like someone had been walking slowly or crouching. At first I thought they might have been old, maybe from before I arrived, but I realized they were on top of some broken twigs I had snapped off the day before while gathering kindling. They were fresh and close to my tent. I looked around and didn't see anyone. I called out instinctively, just a sharp, "Hey!" toward the trees, but no reply. Still, I didn't panic. Could have been some other camper, maybe a local who knew about the quarry. Maybe they came late at night to swim or fish and didn't see my tent in the dark. It was weird, yeah, but not unheard of. Still, I kept my pistol in my pocket for the rest of the day. I didn't swim that afternoon. I mostly stayed near camp, reading a paperback I'd brought and keeping an ear out. Around noon, I heard something moving in the trees up the ridge behind me. Not an animal crashing through undergrowth, but slower, careful movement, like someone stepping deliberately. I stood up and scanned the trees but couldn't see anything. Then nothing. Total silence for a while. By sunset, I'd convinced myself it was all in my head. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. Maybe the footprints were older than I thought. I tried to relax and cooked some pasta over the burner. That night, I didn't build a fire. I wanted to lie low. I zipped the tent tight, slid the pistol under my sleeping bag, and left the lantern on the lowest setting. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of twigs snapping. Close. I froze. I didn't sit up, didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there holding my breath. Something was moving outside. Not far. I could hear footsteps. They weren't heavy, not stomping or running, but slow, cautious. They circled the tent once, then again, then silence. I waited there, sweating under my bag, hand clenched around the pistol grip. I didn't hear anything else until the birds started chirping at dawn. When I finally stepped out of the tent that morning, I found more barefoot prints. They circled my tent several times. Some of them looked like they had toe drag, like whoever made them was crouching or crawling. I found a smudge of dirt on the tent wall near the zipper. A palm print. I didn't wait around. I packed up camp in under 15 minutes, barely stopping to make sure everything was in the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw it all in the trunk and drove back down the dirt road, bouncing hard over every rut, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. My heart didn't stop racing until I was halfway back to Chillicothe. I reported it to the county sheriff's office when I got back to town, just in case. They didn't seem too concerned. Said it was probably a squatter or some local messing around. Maybe, maybe not. I'll never know who was out there, watching me, walking barefoot around my tent in the middle of the night. But I know this, if I'd stayed another night, I think something bad would have happened. I've gone camping since then, but only in campgrounds. I don't go off-grid anymore. Not alone. Not after that. I drove out of Des Moines late that Friday afternoon with no real plan except to get away for the weekend. I'd packed light, just my old tent, a thick sleeping bag, my small stove, a lantern, a cooler with a few frozen meals and water bottles, and the essentials like a first aid kit, compass, and my old hunting knife. I wasn't planning on hiking far. Just wanted to spend a quiet night out in nature, clear my head. I'd had a stressful week, work deadlines piling up, calls from the bank about some payment screw-up, and the usual city noise getting on my nerves. I figured a night out in the middle of nowhere would help reset me. I picked a spot near Brush Creek, about 2 hours southeast of the city. I'd been out there a couple times when I was younger, mostly during college with friends. The place was never crowded, not even during peak season, and it was early October now. Leaves had just started turning, and it was a bit chilly, mid-50s and dropping as the sun went down. I didn't expect to run into anyone else out there. I turned off the county road onto a gravel path that ran deep through rows of pine and elm. The trees were tight together, branches heavy with the beginning of fall rain. My tires crunched slow over the gravel, bouncing through potholes and wet dips where water had collected. Eventually, I pulled into a narrow clearing just big enough for my car and a small tent. I parked, stepped out, and breathed in the cold air. Wet earth, leaves, and that damp forest smell mixed together. The sky was gray and low, and there was a drizzle starting soft, steady. I checked the time. It was just after 6. Sunset wouldn't be for another hour or so, but the clouds made it feel later. I figured I'd better set up before it got worse. I pitched my tent off the side of the clearing, a few feet away from the brush and trees. The ground was muddy but manageable. I laid out a plastic tarp underneath, anchored the corners, and unfolded my gear. By the time I got everything settled and started heating some soup over my little camp stove, the rain was coming down harder. Not a storm, but steady enough to make everything around me slick and loud. I zipped myself into my raincoat and sat on a folding stool just under a thick limb, trying to keep dry. I ate slow, looking out into the trees. The brush beyond the clearing was dense, and with the rain coming down, everything looked gray and blurred. It was quiet except for the water hitting leaves and the occasional creak from the trees moving in the wind. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, even if you know no one else is out there. By the time I finished eating, the light was almost gone. I cleaned up my gear, stuffed everything into the tent, and zipped myself inside. I changed out of my wet jeans, put on some dry sweatpants, and crawled into the sleeping bag. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising. I was miles away from any main road. For a while, I just laid there, listening to the rain drum on the nylon above me. It was relaxing in a way. I remember thinking maybe this was exactly what I needed. No notifications, no voices, no deadlines. Just rain and wind. I started to doze off, but a noise pulled me back awake. It was faint at first, like something rustling outside the tent. I froze and listened. Rain still falling, steady. Then another sound, closer. A kind of crack like a branch being stepped on. I sat up slowly. My heart picked up. I stayed still, waiting, hoping it was just a deer. The woods had plenty of them. Could have been one stepping too close, sniffing around. Then I heard it again. Another snap, this time to the left side of the tent. I reached over and grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and shined it toward the fabric wall. I couldn't see anything through it, just the shape of the raindrops sliding down. I stayed silent, breathing through my nose, trying not to make noise. I heard something shift outside, like weight moving through mud. It was soft, but there. I unzipped my sleeping bag slowly and reached down for my knife. I didn't plan on using it, but it made me feel better. I listened for another minute. Silence now, just rain. I sat like that for a while, maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer. Eventually, I told myself it was probably nothing, just a raccoon or a deer passing through. I didn't hear anything else. Still, I kept the knife close and left the flashlight on low next to me. I laid back down and tried to sleep, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was a little past 1 in the morning when I woke up again. I know because I checked my watch. Rain was still coming down, heavier now. The wind had picked up too. The trees were swaying more, groaning like old wood ready to snap. But that wasn't what woke me. There was a noise outside, different this time. Not an animal. It sounded like metal. A clink. Then a slow, dragging sound. I sat up fast, heart hammering. I turned the flashlight to full power and aimed it at the tent wall. Still couldn't see anything. I crawled to the zipper, knife in my other hand, and waited. The sound stopped. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to unzip the tent and find someone standing there. Or worse, another clink. This time right near the back of the tent, near the brush line. I made a decision I didn't really think through. I grabbed the flashlight, pushed the knife into the pocket of my sweatpants, and unzipped the tent fast. The cold air and rain hit me hard, but I stepped out. The beam of my light cut through the dark. Trees, rain, brush, nothing moved. I turned in a slow circle, breathing hard, listening. My boots sank into the mud. I walked toward the noise, where I'd heard the dragging sound. I found nothing. No footprints, not in the mud anyway. No broken branches. I circled back to the other side of the tent. Still nothing. Then I saw something strange at the edge of the clearing. A rope. It was thick, maybe half an inch in diameter, soaked with rain and stretched across the ground from one tree to another, about knee height. It hadn't been there before. I would have noticed. The hell was it doing here? I followed it with the flashlight. It was tied taut between two trees. Looked like it had been set up recently. No moss on it, no dirt. My stomach dropped. Was someone messing with me? I backed away from it and looked around again, shining the flashlight through the woods, trying to catch movement. Then I saw something else. About 15 feet into the trees, there was a pile of branches, stacked, almost like a makeshift blind or cover. It blended in well. I wouldn't have noticed if the beam hadn't hit it just right. I walked toward it slowly, each step squishing in the mud. When I got close enough, I saw what it really was. A hunting stand. Not the usual kind up in a tree, but a ground setup. Camouflage tarp, tied between some branches, with a small camp stool behind it. The stool was empty, but there were boot prints all around it. Deep ones. My skin went cold. I backed away slowly and looked toward my tent. I had a decision to make, and fast. I could get in my car and leave, but my keys were still inside the tent. I cursed myself under my breath, then ran. I didn't care about noise anymore. I reached the tent, ducked inside, grabbed my bag and keys, and bolted to the car. When I turned the key in the ignition, the engine struggled. Once, twice, caught on the third try. I slammed it into reverse, turned hard, and bounced out of the clearing. My headlights flashed through the trees, catching the rope again before I turned. That wasn't just a trap. Someone was watching me. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I drove all the way back to Des Moines, straight through the night, wet and shaking, headlights sweeping across endless blacktop and rain. I didn't call the cops. What would I say? Someone strung a rope across my camp? Sat in the woods watching me? It was probably nothing, but I didn't believe that. The next day, I went over my gear. I noticed something I hadn't before. My cooler had been unzipped slightly, and one of the water bottles was missing. It wasn't just animals. Someone had walked right up to my stuff while I was sleeping. I never went back to that area. I threw the tent away. I bought locks for my doors even though I lived on the third floor. Every little sound at night made me sit up in bed, straining to hear. I didn't camp again for a long time. It's been 6 years now. I still think about that night every time it rains. Every time I hear a branch crack in the wind. I think about that rope, that stool, whoever was sitting out there in the dark, waiting. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. Maybe they were planning something worse. I don't know. All I know is I got out of there, and I didn't go back. Not once. I was 36 when it happened. That was in 2017, early October, just outside a town called Craig in northwest Colorado. I had driven there alone from Missoula, Montana, mostly to clear my head. I'd gone through a weird patch. My dog had died a couple months before, work was a mess, and my dad had been in and out of the hospital. I didn't really know what I was doing with myself at that point, but I knew I needed to be away from everything. So I packed my truck with my gear, loaded my cooler with food and some cold beers, and drove south. I had always liked camping alone. People always talked about how unsafe it was, especially as a guy on his own out in unfamiliar woods, but I liked the silence. There was something about being surrounded by trees, hearing nothing but wind and wildlife, that made me feel like my thoughts could finally slow down. I didn't really plan where I was going. I just looked at a map, found some green space near the Flat Tops Wilderness area, and started driving. I left the main road and followed a winding Forest Service route until I found a little turnout that led to a clearing big enough for my tent and a fire pit. There weren't any marked campsites in that area, and that's how I liked it. No one around for miles, as far as I could tell. I set up camp late in the afternoon. The sun was dropping fast behind the tall pines, so I worked quick. Set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, laid out my food bin and water, and collected enough wood to get through the night. I kept things simple, just a small fire, a warm dinner, and a couple beers. It got cold fast once the sun was gone. The wind picked up and hissed through the trees. I could hear the groan of old branches shifting overhead and the far-off yip of coyotes. I was used to that kind of noise. I'd grown up hunting and camping in Montana, so none of it bothered me. In fact, it made me feel like I was in the right place. But I did notice something that night, something I shrugged off at first. Around 1 a.m., I was lying awake in my sleeping bag, not quite asleep, but not fully awake either. I'd been dozing in and out when I thought I heard what sounded like slow footsteps near my tent. Not animals, not the skittering kind of movement that deer or raccoons make. These were slow, steady, almost human sounding. I held my breath and listened. They moved around one side of the tent and then stopped. Just stopped. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a large animal sniffing around. After a while, I didn't hear anything else, so I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, there weren't any tracks that I could see. The ground was mostly dry pine needles, which didn't hold prints well. I figured it was nothing. Maybe I'd been half dreaming and imagined it. So I stayed another night. The second night is when things really started to feel off. I'd spent the whole day hiking about 10 miles from camp, just wandering through the backcountry and taking in the color changes. The aspens were glowing yellow and orange, and there wasn't a single person in sight the whole day. When I got back to camp around sunset, I immediately noticed something strange. My camp chair, which I had left next to the fire pit, was tipped over. Not a big deal by itself, but I had placed a full canteen of water on the seat that morning. The canteen was now on the ground, standing upright like someone had gently set it there. I didn't jump to conclusions. I thought maybe wind knocked it over or maybe it shifted and fell naturally. But something about it felt weird, like it had been done carefully, intentionally. That night, I didn't drink. I kept the fire low and stayed alert. I stayed outside until around midnight, then crawled into my sleeping bag and left my boots by the door. I kept a small hatchet in the tent with me, just in case. Again, I heard footsteps around 1 a.m., same pace, same sound, but this time they came closer. I could hear them circle the tent slowly, once, twice, and then stop right at the back of the tent, opposite where my head was. They stayed there. My heart was beating so loud I could barely hear anything else. I didn't move. I didn't unzip anything. And then, after maybe 5 minutes of total silence, I heard something else. A soft clicking sound, like a rock tapping against another rock, in a rhythm. Not fast, just tap, 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 right outside the tent. Still no footsteps, no voice, just that clicking. Then it stopped, and after a while, the footsteps slowly walked away. I stayed up the rest of the night, barely blinking. At first light, I crawled out of the tent and looked around. Nothing. No prints. No broken branches. The chair was upright again. Everything looked normal, but I could feel something wrong in my chest, a kind of pressure that didn't leave. I had planned to stay 4 days, but I told myself I'd leave after the third. The third day, I didn't hike far. I stuck close to camp. I chopped extra wood and made sure I had everything packed and ready to go in the truck in case I needed to leave in a hurry. I kept checking the edge of the woods, waiting to see someone. A ranger, a hiker, a hunter, anyone. But I never did. I didn't even hear distant engines or voices, just birds and wind. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, back against the truck, wrapped in a blanket. I didn't want to draw attention. I watched the tree line for hours. Around 11 p.m., the forest went quiet. Too quiet. Not a single bird call.
No breeze. No bugs.
Just total stillness. That's when I saw something. On the far side of the clearing, maybe 30 feet from my tent, something moved between the trees. It was fast, but I saw it shoulder height, low to the ground, too broad to be a deer. And it moved like it was crawling. I could hear the soft crunch of pine needles under slow pressure. Then it stopped, just at the edge of the firelight that wasn't even lit. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. And then it stood up. I swear, whatever it was, it stood up on two legs. It was tall, maybe 6 feet, maybe more. I couldn't see its face clearly, but the silhouette was wrong. Too thin in some places, too wide in others. It looked like it was wearing fur, or maybe it had fur. I don't know. It just stood there, watching. And then, it stepped back into the woods and disappeared. I waited for hours before I moved. I finally got into the truck around 3 a.m., locked the doors, and stayed awake until sunrise. As soon as there was enough light, I broke down camp as fast as I could. I didn't even eat. I just threw everything in the bed of the truck, double-checked that nothing was left behind, and drove out. As I was leaving, maybe 10 minutes back down the dirt road, I saw something in the side mirror, off to the left, back where my sight had been. There was a figure standing in the trees, watching, not moving, just standing there. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove straight to Steamboat Springs and got a motel. I slept for 12 hours. When I woke up, I couldn't shake the image of that thing standing outside the tent. That weird, careful clicking. The upright water canteen. It all played back in my mind like a loop I couldn't break. Over the next few weeks, I tried to explain it. Maybe it was a hunter messing with me. Maybe some lunatic living off the grid. Maybe even a prank, though who would be out there in the middle of nowhere just to pull that kind of thing off? It didn't make sense. I started looking into reports from that part of Colorado. I found a couple forums where people talked about strange things they'd seen while camping. Most of it was nonsense, UFOs, Bigfoot sightings, ghost stories, but some of them talked about hearing clicking sounds at night. Some mentioned upright animals. I stopped reading after a while. It made me feel worse. Eventually, I went back to work. I got on with things, but I haven't camped alone since. I still hike. I still go into the woods, but not overnight, not out of sight of other people. Sometimes I still think about it when I'm lying in bed at night and things go quiet. I'll remember the way the footsteps circled my tent, the way it stood up on two legs like it wasn't unnatural at all, like it had done it before. I remember the way it just watched. And the worst part is, I don't know if it was someone pretending to be something else or something pretending to be someone. But I do know one thing for sure, whatever it wasn't afraid of me. Not even a little. It wanted me to hear it. It wanted me to know it was there. And that's why I left. Not because I was scared of what it was, but because I knew it wasn't scared of me. And that was enough. It was late September of 2016 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the Auvergne region of central France. I was 34 at the time, living in Lyon, working long hours at a logistics company, and badly needed a break from the routine. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but I had done a few camping trips before, usually with friends. This time I just wanted quiet. I wanted something away from people, phones, noise, and the rest of it. I had a week off and figured I'd spend 3 nights out in nature and come back before the weekend. I picked a forested area near a small town called Saint-Jean-d'Alliers. It wasn't one of the big tourist spots, which is exactly why I chose it. There was a stretch of woods just west of the town with no marked campsites, but I'd read about it on a French backpacking forum. A few people had posted about going there for peace and solitude. The photos looked nice. Dense forest, grassy clearings, small creeks. It seemed perfect. I packed my tent, food, a portable stove, a good flashlight, and a few other essentials into the trunk of my car and left early on a Tuesday morning. The drive took a bit longer than expected. The roads got narrower and twistier the closer I got. Around noon, I stopped at a small market in town for some extra water bottles and firewood, then drove another 20 minutes west until the paved road turned to gravel. I kept going until I couldn't anymore. The path got rough, and I found a small open patch off to the right where I could park my car out of sight. I locked it, slung on my pack, and started walking into the trees. I hiked for about an hour, moving slowly. The trail wasn't official, more like a faint line of flattened grass that others had made over time. I followed it until I found a decent spot. It was flat, surrounded by trees, and not too close to any visible path or water source. I wanted privacy, but I also didn't want to deal with wet shoes or bugs from a nearby stream. By mid-afternoon, I had the tent up and my small campsite arranged. The weather was nice, clear skies, no wind. I sat on a tree stump, drank some water, and just breathed in the silence. It was the kind of silence that you forget exists when you live in a city. No cars, no people, just the occasional chirp of a bird or the sound of leaves rustling. I spent the rest of the day walking around nearby, not venturing too far, just getting familiar with the area. I ate a cold meal around 6, read a bit, and went to bed when it got dark. The first night was uneventful, though I did wake up a few times. I wasn't scared, just restless. The forest made strange noises, cracking branches, wind shifting through trees. Normal stuff, but when you're alone, every sound feels louder. Still, I drifted in and out of sleep and woke up with the sun filtering through the tent fabric. I made coffee, ate a protein bar, and planned to hike a little further into the woods that day, leaving my tent behind so I wouldn't have to carry everything. Around 10 in the morning, I packed a day bag with snacks, water, and my map. I followed a narrow deer trail that veered northwest, away from where I came in. I didn't see anyone, not even footprints. The place felt untouched. After about 2 hours of wandering, I found a spot with a slight elevation that gave me a view of the forest canopy stretching for miles. I sat there for a long time, ate, and just listened to the wind. It was peaceful. That's what I kept telling myself. Peaceful. When I got back to my campsite in the late afternoon, nothing looked disturbed. My tent was untouched, everything where I'd left it. I started boiling water for dinner when I noticed something a bit odd. A few pine cones had been arranged near the base of a tree. 4 or 5 of them placed in a circle. Could have been animals, sure, but it looked a little too neat. I told myself it was nothing, maybe even something I'd done the day before and forgotten. I moved them aside, sat down to eat, and shook it off. That night was different. I fell asleep just after dark. I woke up sometime later, hours later, I think. There was no sound. That silence I'd liked before now felt heavy. I opened my eyes and lay there, trying to figure out what had woken me up. Then I heard something. Footsteps. Slow, soft, but definite. Human. They were maybe 30 feet away, moving through the underbrush. I froze. My heart started pounding. I turned off my small lamp and sat in the dark. The steps continued, slowly circling my camp. I couldn't see anything through the thin tent walls, but I could feel someone out there. The steps paused, then started again, this time further away, fading into the woods. I sat perfectly still for a long time. I didn't breathe much. I didn't move. Eventually, I heard nothing but the wind again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At sunrise, I got out of the tent. Everything looked normal. Nothing taken, nothing touched. But I didn't imagine those steps. I knew what I heard. I packed up a few things into my day bag, left the tent standing, and decided to go back toward the car. I just wanted to make sure it was okay. I was starting to feel like I needed to leave. The hike back took longer than I remembered. I was tense the whole time, looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got to the spot where I'd parked, I stopped dead. There were footprints in the dirt next to my car. Not mine. I'd parked carefully to avoid leaving tracks. These were fresh, large, and led around the car, both sides, front and back. The windows weren't broken, the doors still locked, but someone had been there. That was it. I made up my mind to leave. I hiked back to the camp fast. I shoved everything into my pack, ripped the tent down without folding it, and started moving. I didn't eat. I barely drank. I just wanted out. I was maybe 15 minutes from the car when I saw him. He was standing in the woods, maybe 20 meters off the trail to my right. Still, just standing there. He was wearing dark pants, a green jacket, and a black cap. He wasn't doing anything, just looking at me. I stopped. My heart was hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. He didn't say anything, didn't wave, didn't move. I took a step backward. Still nothing. I turned and started walking faster, not running, just fast enough to create space. I didn't look back again until I reached the car. He wasn't behind me. I threw my gear into the trunk, jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't wait to catch my breath. I backed up, turned around, and sped down the gravel road until I hit pavement. I drove all the way to Clermont-Ferrand and checked into a cheap hotel. I kept the TV on all night, not because I was watching it, but because I needed noise. I didn't sleep much again, but I felt safer than I did in the woods. The next morning, I reported what happened to a small local station before heading back to Lyon. I didn't have much to give them. No license plate, no photos, nothing stolen. They took down my statement, but I don't think they were all that interested. The officer said people wander through those woods sometimes, especially hunters, and it was probably nothing. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I've never been camping alone again. I kept thinking about that man, the way he just stood there, the footprints around my car, the slow footsteps in the night. All of it added up to something off, something not right. He didn't try to hurt me, not directly, but it felt like he was playing some kind of game, watching, waiting. I'll never know what he wanted. Maybe he was just a local who didn't like strangers. Maybe he was more than that. I've read about people disappearing in the woods. I think about that sometimes, how easy it would have been for someone to disappear out there.
No cameras.
No cell service. No one nearby. I was lucky. I left before anything worse happened. That's the only good part of the story. I got out. I was 26 the summer I decided to camp alone in a remote part of southern Iowa. I had been working an office job in Des Moines for a few years, the kind of work where your eyes glaze over halfway through the day and the walls start to close in if you don't break free once in a while. I needed to get out for a weekend and breathe somewhere that didn't smell like microwaved lunches and air conditioning. I didn't want to go to a regular campground. Those felt too packed, too fake. Families blasting music, people stumbling around drunk at night, kids screaming nonstop. I wanted silence, isolation, something real. So I picked a spot I'd read about online. It wasn't marked on any big tourist maps. Just an old trail near a place called Pickerel Bend, about 2 hours southeast of the city, where logging companies used to operate until the mid-90s. Someone on a forum had mentioned you could follow one of the old service roads up past a washed-out culvert and reach a ridge overlooking a stretch of forest that had been left to regrow naturally. They said no one ever went up there. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear on a Friday morning, small tent, cold food, sleeping bag, my old .38 revolver just in case, and drove out in my beat-up Nissan. The last 20 miles were gravel roads that twisted through old cornfields and thick brush. I only passed 2 other vehicles the entire time: a rusted truck parked outside a small cabin and an old green Ford that drove by slow, the guy behind the wheel giving me a long look as he passed. I found the washed-out culvert. It was deeper than I expected. Had to backtrack and gun it over the shallowest part with my tires bouncing and the undercarriage scraping against the edge. The road beyond that was barely a road anymore. Grass had started to grow in the center, and the tire ruts were full of rainwater in spots. But I made it. I parked where the path narrowed too much for a car and started walking. It was early afternoon. Sun was strong, but the trees gave decent cover. Birds were out. The only sound was the wind moving through the leaves and the occasional buzzing from dragonflies dancing over puddles. The further I walked, the quieter it got. About half a mile in, I found the ridge. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a rise above the trees with a flat clearing that dropped off steep on one side. The forest stretched out below, thick and layered, a mess of greens and shadows that went on and on. It felt like standing on the edge of something older than everything else. I set up my tent off to one side near a patch of ferns and flattened grass. Someone had camped here before. There was a half-burned circle of stones and a few rusty nails sticking out of a piece of wood someone had probably used as a bench. But nothing fresh. I made a little dinner: crackers, canned chicken, a few granola bars, and settled in as the sun dropped below the trees. That night, I sat by the cold fire pit with my jacket zipped up, watching the stars come out. No sounds but the woods. I felt good. No phone signal.
No headlights.
No people. Just me and the dark. I slept easy. The next morning, things felt off, but not in a dramatic way. Just off. It started when I noticed my boots had been moved. I always lined them up outside the tent flap. I'd done that since I was a kid, but when I unzipped the tent to get out, one of them was a few feet away near the log I'd used as a seat, and the other was sitting upright facing toward the ridge, like someone had picked it up and set it down again. I didn't panic. I figured maybe I kicked one in my sleep and didn't realize it, or maybe a raccoon or something dragged it, though there weren't any bite marks or scuffs. I checked around the tent. No tracks. The ground was damp in spots, but nothing showed up. I chalked it up to me being too much in my own head. Still, I loaded the revolver and slipped it into my day pack. I spent the day walking the old trails. Some of them were almost gone, swallowed by weeds and branches. I saw deer at one point, a group of them frozen still and watching me as I passed. I marked a few trees with strips of red tape to find my way back. I hiked maybe 5 miles in a big loop and returned by mid-afternoon. That's when I saw the new mark on one of the trees near my tent. It was small, just 3 shallow horizontal lines cut into the bark, about chest height. Fresh. The wood underneath was still wet. I didn't do that, and it hadn't been there that morning. I stood staring at it for a while, listening. The wind had died down. No birds. Just that thick silence again, like the woods were holding their breath. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. People pass through the woods all the time. Hunters, hikers, whoever. But I hadn't seen a single person, not one, since I left the car. And this spot wasn't easy to reach. The idea that someone had come through here while I was gone, close enough to mark a tree a few feet from my tent, made my stomach turn a little. Still, I stayed. I convinced myself it didn't mean anything. Could have been old. Could have been animals. My mind was just making it a bigger deal than it was. That night, I didn't sleep well. Something woke me up around 2 a.m. A sharp rustling outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away. Not wind, not small. Something stepping on dry leaves. I froze, sat there in my sleeping bag, eyes wide, listening. There was a sniffing sound, not close but not far. Then silence. I sat there, hand gripping the revolver under the sleeping bag, for at least an hour before I finally nodded off again. The next morning, I found a second mark. Same kind as the first. 3 slashes in the bark. But this one was lower, almost at knee level, and closer to where I'd parked my car. I packed up fast, threw everything into my bag, collapsed the tent without folding it, and started walking back to the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. The whole way down, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't a dramatic feeling, just that quiet weight pressing in from the trees. No birds again, no movement. I kept checking behind me. When I got back to where I'd left the car, my heart nearly stopped. It had been moved. Not far, just a few feet, like someone had pushed it backwards slightly and then stopped. The grass under the tires was crushed in a way that didn't match where I'd parked. And on the driver's side mirror, there was a string tied around the arm, just a piece of black thread, dangling. I unlocked the car fast, threw my stuff in, and got the hell out of there. I didn't even stop to check the undercarriage or the tires until I was already back on a real road. Nothing was slashed, nothing was broken, but the message was clear. Someone had been watching, following. They knew I was alone. They wanted me to know they'd been close enough to touch my tent, move my things, mark the trees, move the car. I didn't report anything. What would I say? That I got scared camping? There was no crime, no proof. But I never went back. Not to that ridge, not to that trail. Sometimes I look up satellite images of the area, zoom in on the old logging roads, try to see if anyone else has gone out there. The forums don't talk about it anymore. That whole area's just a blank spot now, lost in the green. And sometimes I wonder how long they'd been there before I noticed. How long they watched. What would have happened if I'd stayed just one more night? My grandfather passed away in April 2018. I was 25 then, living in northern Oregon, just outside a small town called Estacada. He wasn't just my grandfather. He had raised me for most of my life. I didn't really know my father, and my mom had struggled with addiction, so my grandfather had been the one steady figure throughout everything. When he died, suddenly, of a heart attack at 72, I felt like the ground under me had shifted. I didn't cry right away. For weeks, I felt this strange emptiness that just stayed with me. I took some time off work. I wasn't thinking clearly. I had this idea that I needed to get away. Just me and the trees, the quiet, the open space. Something told me I'd find peace out there. So, I packed my gear and drove out toward Mt. Hood National Forest. It was early May, cold at night but not freezing, and there weren't many campers yet. I wanted that, no one around, just me. My grandfather had taken me camping there when I was a kid. We used to hike a 5-mile trail off one of the service roads that ran along a ridge, then veer off into the forest to set up a hidden camp near an old logging road. It was a spot only he and I knew about. We called it our place. I decided to go back to that same area. I hadn't been there since I was maybe 16. I knew the forest would have changed over the years, but I had a pretty good memory. I found the trailhead with no problem. The road was still in rough shape, dirt and gravel with long ruts and potholes. I drove my truck as far as I could before parking it under some trees, way off the main highway. Then I hiked in. The forest felt heavier than I remembered. Maybe it was just the grief sitting on my chest, or maybe it was something else. I don't know, but I felt it right away, like the air wasn't moving right. The sky was overcast, and the clouds sat low above the trees. It smelled like wet bark, rotting leaves, and pine needles. The ground was soft and dark from spring rain, and the only sound was the creaking of branches and the occasional crack of something shifting deep in the woods. It took me about 2 hours to reach the old spot, following what little I remembered and using my compass. The logging road had faded, just a narrow scar through the undergrowth now, but I recognized the slight slope, the big moss-covered boulder we used to sit on, and the cluster of birch trees that had a few weird scars on their trunks. I smiled for the first time in weeks when I saw it. I set up my tent about 20 yards from the boulder. I kept everything basic. One-person tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, and my food in a bear canister. I brought a cheap folding chair, a hatchet, and my grandfather's old hunting knife. I didn't plan on hunting anything, but I liked the weight of it. He used to keep it on his belt every time we camped. By the time I had camp set, the sky had started to darken. No sunset, just this slow, gray fade. I made instant noodles, boiled water for tea, and sat quietly in my chair listening to the forest breathe. At night, sounds are different in the woods. Everything seems closer. I could hear distant howls, probably coyotes, branches snapping, and the occasional flutter of birds. But then I heard something else. It wasn't anything loud, just a faint series of steady cracks, like someone stepping on sticks, far off but coming closer. Not fast, not slow, just steady. I froze. My body locked up without thinking. I waited, listened, then it stopped. I figured it was a deer, maybe an elk, but I still grabbed the flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing, just shadows. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just outside the tent. But morning came like it always does, and everything looked normal. Still, the feeling stayed with me. I started to think maybe this trip had been a mistake. But I didn't want to go home yet. I felt like I owed it to my grandfather to stay. I made breakfast, packed a small bag, and hiked out to a nearby ridge that overlooked a valley. I sat there for hours thinking about him, about how quiet he used to be, and how I never really told him how much he meant to me. I cried for the first time since the funeral. When I got back to camp in the late afternoon, something felt off. I mean, really off. It was subtle. Nothing was obviously wrong. My gear was all there, but the tent zipper was open, just a few inches. I could have sworn I closed it all the way. I chalked it up to memory. Maybe I was tired and forgot. But the feeling stayed with me. It burrowed into my gut like a worm. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in my bag, staring at the roof of the tent, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. The slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps. But this time it wasn't far. It was near, just beyond the thin nylon wall. I held my breath. My hand went to the hunting knife. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard breathing. I swear to God, just breathing. Not an animal, not sniffing, just the slow inhale and exhale of someone standing still. I wanted to unzip the tent and jump out, scream, run, do something, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, heart hammering in my ears, knife gripped so tight my hand hurt. The breathing lasted maybe a minute, then it faded. I waited until sunrise before moving. When I finally got the courage to look outside, there was nothing. No tracks, no damage, but I packed up. I told myself I was done. I'd hike back to the truck and drive home. Maybe I needed to talk to someone. Maybe I was losing it. The hike back felt longer than I remembered. The trail felt different, overgrown in places where it had been clear just a day before. I moved fast, not taking breaks, not looking back, just focused on the next step. When I reached the road and saw my truck, relief hit me like a wave. But the feeling didn't last. My truck door was open, not just unlocked, open. I stopped cold. My legs wouldn't move for a second. I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. I finally walked to the truck, keeping low, my knife ready. The cab was empty. No signs of damage. Nothing stolen. But someone had definitely been inside. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The second it turned over, I hit the gas and drove. I didn't care about the ruts or the branches scraping the sides. I just needed to leave. When I got back to the main highway, I kept driving. Didn't stop for food, gas, anything. Just went straight home. For days after, I didn't sleep right. I kept thinking about that night, about the breathing, about whoever was in my camp. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. No trail nearby. No other vehicles on that road. Just me. I never told anyone. What could I say? That I heard breathing in the woods? That someone opened my tent? That they stood over me at night, watching, doing nothing? A few months later, I read a story in the local paper. A hunter found a small camp deep in Empty Hood Forest. Not a normal one. It was hidden. They found bones, animals stripped clean, and what looked like a human tooth. No one claimed it. They thought it might have been some hermit living out there, maybe someone dangerous. The area wasn't far from where I'd camped. I haven't been back since, and I never will. That trip didn't give me peace. It didn't bring me closer to my grandfather, but maybe, in a way, it gave me something else. A reminder of how small we are out there, how nature doesn't care about your grief. How some people, the kind who live in shadows, aren't ghosts or monsters. They're real, breathing, waiting. I still have his knife. It's on a shelf above my bed. I haven't touched it since that day. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves just right, I swear I hear the woods again. And I wonder if someone's still out there, waiting. I was 32 when I took that camping trip, alone, in the early fall of 2021. I had just moved back to Pennsylvania after 10 years of city life in Austin. I didn't hate Austin, but the noise, the endless traffic, the people everywhere, I'd had enough of it. I wanted quiet, I wanted stillness. So I moved back home, found a small place near Mifflinburg, and tried to settle back into the rhythm of country life. No one really noticed I was gone. That was the kind of person I was. I liked it that way. I had a new job working from home, data entry for a logistics company, so my days were quiet and monotonous. I stared at spreadsheets most of the day and took long walks afterward. I missed being out in nature more, like I had when I was a kid. I started going on weekend hikes at Bald Eagle State Forest. It wasn't far, maybe 40 minutes from my cabin, and it was massive. More than 190,000 acres of forests, ridges, creeks, and rough terrain. You could spend days out there and not see anyone. That was the appeal. It had rained for a week straight in late September, and when the skies finally cleared, I saw my chance. I took Friday off, packed up my gear, and planned to spend 2 nights alone out in the forest. I didn't pick any established campsite. I wanted isolation. I parked near the Weikert area, left my car just past a small bridge by White Deer Creek, and hiked in 5 miles to a flat area just east of one of the logging roads, deep enough that I wouldn't hear any cars or see any people. I took my dog Max with me. He was a 4-year-old German Shepherd, well-trained, and had gone on plenty of hikes with me before. He was a good dog, the kind that stayed close and didn't bark unless he had a reason. I brought enough food and water for both of us, my usual camping gear, and a .22 rifle just in case. I didn't expect to need it, but there were coyotes out there sometimes. The first day went by quietly. I hiked in, found a clearing that was slightly elevated, dry, with soft moss and some flat ground for the tent. I gathered firewood, set everything up, and cooked a simple meal of rice and beans over the fire. Max curled up beside me, and we watched the forest grow darker together. I felt at peace. It was the first time in months I'd felt like I could breathe. That night was still and cold. I woke up once to relieve myself and noticed how quiet the woods were. It was that thick kind of silence where the sound of your own heartbeat seems loud. No wind, no insects, not even the rustling of animals. Max lifted his head once and stared into the trees, but then laid back down, so I did too. The next morning, I woke early, packed a light bag with snacks and water, and took Max on a long hike northeast. I followed a ridgeline for several miles, stopping occasionally to rest or drink. I saw a few deer, plenty of birds, and a black snake sunning itself on a rock. By mid-afternoon, the wind started picking up, and I decided to head back to camp. I had a GPS tracker and paper map, and I knew the terrain well enough. I wasn't worried, but about half a mile from camp, I noticed Max's behavior change. He stopped walking. His ears went up, his body tense, and he stared down the trail behind us. I stopped too, listening. I couldn't hear anything. I waited maybe 30 seconds before encouraging him forward. He walked again, but slower, glancing back repeatedly. His tail was low, not wagging like it usually did. I assumed maybe he caught the scent of a coyote or bear and brushed it off. Back at camp, I stoked the fire, boiled water, and made some noodles. Max ate some kibble, but he was still acting off. He stayed alert, eyes scanning the trees, his body on edge. I tried to calm him down, brushing his fur, but he wouldn't relax. When it got dark, he sat outside the tent, refusing to come in. That night, I didn't sleep much. It wasn't the cold or the hard ground. It was the feeling, that creeping awareness in the back of your skull that something's not right. I kept listening for sounds, but there weren't any. No owls, no branches snapping, not even the wind. Max eventually came into the tent just before midnight but stayed awake, shifting his weight around, ears twitching. Then around 2 a.m. I heard it. It wasn't loud, just a soft, steady crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Not fast, not slow, deliberate. Max growled low in his throat. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The steps were coming from behind the tent, maybe 30 feet out. I didn't move. The fire outside had died down, so it was pitch black. I thought about calling out, but I didn't. I wasn't about to let someone know I was alone. I reached for the rifle quietly, safety still on, and waited. The steps stopped after a minute or so. Max was silent now, head up, staring at the tent wall. I didn't hear anything else that night. By sunrise, I hadn't slept a wink. I got out of the tent slowly, scanned the area. There were no prints I could see, but the leaves were thick. I didn't find anything out of place. Max sniffed around but didn't react. Still, something was wrong. I decided to pack up early and hike back to the car. It wasn't worth staying another night. I took down camp quickly. Everything went back into my pack, and we set off just after 8 a.m. About 2 miles in, we came across something that made my stomach tighten. Off to the side of the trail, maybe 15 feet in, there was a small pile of cigarette butts. Fresh. No rain had hit them, and they weren't there 2 days ago. I noticed some boot tracks nearby, pressed into the soft moss, heading in the same direction we were walking. I didn't smoke. I hadn't seen anyone on the way in. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. This wasn't a maintained trail. It wasn't even marked. You had to bushwhack to get here. Max was tense again. His ears kept swiveling. I moved quicker now, checking over my shoulder often, staying sharp. We passed the halfway point around noon, took a short break to drink some water, and then pushed on. That's when I saw it. A tarp, green, partially hidden between 2 clusters of trees, set up like a makeshift shelter, no more than 20 yards off the trail. I stopped. I looked closely. Under the tarp was a blue sleeping bag, half unzipped. There were some food wrappers scattered around, a half-full bottle of water, and a dirty red backpack leaning against a tree. No one was there. It looked like whoever set it up had either left recently or was nearby watching. Max growled again. I didn't go near it. I turned around and started moving fast. Not running, but fast enough that I was breathing hard. I had the rifle in one hand now, just in case. I kept looking back. That's when I noticed we weren't alone anymore. There was a man on the trail behind us, maybe 200 feet back, walking slow. He wore a dark hoodie, tan pants, and carried something in his hand. Maybe a hatchet or a stick. Couldn't tell. He didn't say anything, didn't call out, just kept walking, same direction we were heading. I didn't stop to get a better look. I moved faster. The problem was, there were only so many ways out. I had parked near a small trailhead that led over a narrow bridge, the kind where you can only fit one vehicle. If this guy knew the area, he might know where I was headed. The next hour was a blur of constant movement. I didn't stop to rest. Max stayed close, silent, clearly alert to the danger. I didn't see the man again, but I didn't slow down either. I reached the final stretch by late afternoon. My car was still there. No other vehicles around. The bridge was clear. I didn't feel safe until I was halfway down the gravel road, far from the trailhead. I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was home. That night, I locked every door and window. I didn't sleep again. 2 days later, I drove back to the state forest office and told them what happened. Not about the man directly, but about the tarp camp I saw off trail, the cigarette pile, the tracks. They said they'd send someone out to check, but I never followed up. I didn't want to know if they found anything. I never went camping alone again after that. Sometimes, I still wonder what would have happened if I stayed that second night. If I had gotten up and looked around when I heard the footsteps. If I'd gone to check the tarp shelter. I don't know. I think that man was out there the whole time. Maybe watched me set up camp, maybe followed me the entire way in. Maybe he was just looking for a place to sleep and didn't mean any harm. But maybe not. The woods don't care about your plans. They don't care that you came out to find peace. Out there, you're just another thing moving through the trees, alone, with no one to hear you if something goes wrong. So no, nothing supernatural happened. But that doesn't mean it wasn't real.